Okay, so this is our third session on early Greek thinking. This little book by Heidegger on the pre-Socratics. This time we're talking about the Parmenides fragment, the Moira, whatever fate fragment, which is the only one on Parmenides in the book. We also did a few selections of reading about the three ways from Introduction to Metaphysics that we made available, Pete made available online as extra text on him on Parmenides. There's also a whole lecture course book he has on Parmenides, which is this one, although it mostly covers the introduction to the poem and the meanings of some of the terms, rather than getting deeply into the philosophical substance of the Parmenides didactic poem. But it's still definitely worth reading on for his take on Parmenides generally. So anyway, that's just background on some of the stuff that he has on Parmenides. The stuff we're reading is obviously about this one fragment here. Sort of a little bit wider context. We're interested in this whole book in part because we heard the claim from Heidegger that there was a brief glimpse of truth as aletheia at the dawn of Western thinking before the Socratics and the pre-Socratics, that then went into some sort of eclipse after the Socratics, and remained there until re-unearthed by Heidegger, something like that. Anyway, so different notions of the idea that the notions of truth have a history, that the disclosure of being is something which has a history. It's one of the things in play here. And does he substantiate the claim that there was some greater depth on some of those things in the pre-Socratics that then went away? Also, there's a broader claim involved in all that, which is something like that there's some event of errancy or event of hiddenness of the question of being in Western metaphysics as such, in all of Western metaphysics. We have to see whether or not that is borne out by the substance of the book. Beyond that, we just want to engage with what he actually has to tell us about Parmenides himself, understand Parmenides, what Parmenides is saying, and treat Heidegger as just a good philosophy of history or history of philosophy professor who can tell us that sort of things, as well as put this in his own problematic. We also want to see along the way what he tells us about what he thinks about his own philosophy, independent of whether or not any of his historical claims about Parmenides, which are kind of secondary to the philosophical truth claims each of them is advancing. That's just broader outline of things we might want to bring up as problems here. I'm going to do it my usual thing, which is going around and asking everyone the ministry of the reading and first impressions. If you've got significant background in Parmenides besides reading this text, let me know, so we'll help to figure out what level I should pitch things at. Because some of this is long, translations from relatively long passages in Greek, although some are very short passages in Greek. If you have significant familiarity with Greek, you can also mention that if that's helpful. Dan, you want to start us off? Probably read it a long time ago.
Yeah, I read it twice. I read it twice. The last time like 3-4 months ago, and no new impressions. But I read also the most of other Heidegger's book about Parmenides and the Greeks, but no first impressions. That's all.
Did you reread any of the Introduction to Metaphysics sections on the three ways of Parmenides for this or earlier?
No. I read that book way back, but I didn't went back to that.
Got it. Okay. And did you have any previous, outside of Heidegger, any previous readings in the pre-Socratics, Parmenides in particular, from other things?
No, I read Heraclitus and the others, but not Parmenides.
Gotcha.
And, yeah.
Okay. Pete?
And I'm not muted. So I reread the Moira and the Introduction to Metaphysics. Anytime I read Heidegger, I get something slightly newer, different out of it. I know a little more Heidegger than last time I read it. With the Moira, sort of my usual comment that I can follow most of it, but I can't remember the whole path he took through all the steps he went through. But I recognize what he's doing in some of them. Sometimes it's the ontological difference. that he's pointing out, and other things. There's also a few parts that still baffle me in terms of the grammar that he's finding in the Greek. And with Parmenides, I've read everything because there's not that much, but I can't say I really understand it. I've read this translation and that translation. I understand some bits and pieces, but in no way would I want to take a test on Parmenides.
That's okay. ChatGPT should take the test for you. Can you mention anything further about the bits of the Heidegger specifically that baffle you? Is it just the things you're talking about with the grammatical constructions he's finding, or is there other things in the Heidegger that baffle you?
There's an occasional sentence that I can't fit into my current understanding, and I think I don't know enough about the grammar issues that he's pulling out, stuff like that. I think this time I'm developing an understanding of what he means by Moira. And I think it means understanding of being, the particular understanding of being is my best word for it, which I didn't have before. I'd read it and then I'd think back a few months later, really, what was that word Moira in this essay? And in a few places he has his word for it. He says Moira, comma, some German or English word in the translation. I'm not that convinced by those. I think as a whole, it means a particular understanding of being, and that's that's destining the person, the Dasein that's dealing with the thing.
Yeah. So just, background for everyone else. I realize you're struggling with what meaning he's seeing in it and trying to translate it to his own terms. But in the Greek, right, Moira is a mythological figure. It's the Greek goddess of fate. It is fateful dispensation. It is the apportioner of the order of the whole, something like that. But it's something like a personified, usually a female personified fate. He's reading especially a destiny note in it and a destiny time in it. And because it's a key word, he finds it to be in a key position in Parmenides, if I can put it this way, what Heidegger is diagnosing as Parmenides' phenomenal experience of the thing that he's trying to talk about in this passage, something like that. Heidegger is seeing a note of something like a destining appearing in it. And because that translates to him with something like a revelation of being to the thinker or something like that. That's where you're getting the notes you're hearing there. But in Parmenides, it's on the surface a straightforward mythological reference, and he calls many of his speeches myths. And he has a goddess of truth, and he talks about Themis and the other things. So he's perfectly willing to use these classical figures of Greek mythology and religion, and Moira is fate. Fate, usually not necessarily in the sense of destiny, but in the sense of some overall order. So we can talk more about what that means and where there might be different notes or accents in how Heidegger hears it and how Parmenides hears it when we get to the substance. But just as background, you're right to think that there's a problem here to figure out what Heidegger is reading into Parmenides' use of that word, but that's because Heidegger has his own whole process of philosophical translation, where he thinks that the way to be sympathetic to someone you're reading is to see what are the original phenomena you see in your own understanding you think they're looking at, right? So he's trying to line up what Parmenides could be talking about, not with Parmenides' own scheme of things, but with his Heidegger's scheme of things. But anyway, that's just background on the word itself, if that helps.
And just to throw something in there, I think it's important to realize regarding mythological and writing poems, that this in Parmenides' days, the Greek had been around for a couple centuries as a language. And so there was Homer and Hesiod, and they'd written myths. So the first philosophers, when they came along, said, I want to write something. Well, the form is to write a poem about a myth.
Mm-hmm.
So so Parmenides goes, okay, I want to talk about being, but I'm going to talk about the goddess Aletheia and the goddess Moira.
And not only that, he's talking about, how the previous mortal understanding is to divide all things into the day and the night and this sort of thing. And, there's other elements of the poem that refer back to that, and that's like works and days Hesiod. That's like, light and dark, mythological origins, the whole or something like that. So he's definitely referring to that in many places. That is, he Parmenides. How much of that is also how he's thinking it, right? That's the place where there's room for interpretation. But he certainly, you're absolutely right that it is already a done thing to do that, and Platonic dialogues always have the myth in them, and it's often the most interesting part. It's the place where you use an image to make a point. The allegory of the cave is a myth, right? More. Do you have more, Pete, or should we? Okay, Craig. Reading, first impressions, all that stuff.
Okay, I'll have to say that I had to take a break, and the reason being is I was struggling with context. I mean, we had a fragment here, and a fragment there, and a fragment here, and a fragment there, and I thought I can't work that way without getting some context. So just for the sake of a little bit of context, I jumped into Robert Bella's Religion and Human Evolution 750-page book, which took us through the axial age, and the transition from archaic to axial, which he considers the archaic being more about the early pre-Socratics, and then the actual axial transition being Socrates and the dissension of Socrates. So that gave me some perspective. One of the things that came up in the middle of that Bella referenced was this book, The Route to Parmenides, which is thick, and I'm just starting to dig into it.
Sorry, who's the author again?
Alexander P.D. Moria.
Okay, don't know him.
Yeah, fascinating book. Thicker than whatever, but I'm starting to dig into that. But I did get the reading done. I also had to go back and pick up a little bit of what Nietzsche said to try to understand what it's become more and more apparent that Heidegger is speaking against or struggling with. And but I did get through the reading. I did enjoy the Introduction to Metaphysics read. That seemed to really be a little bit better layout in what Heidegger did there than in the fragment. That was our assignment, but I did get through it, and I'm starting to feel like there's maybe some context to getting to, and the fact that Moira is one of many things that Parmenides went to, and so starting to get a little bit more framework. But
understood. One thing it may be useful if people don't have it or know it already. You can get what fragments we have of Parmenides' whole poem in the original Greek and in a typical translation. I just pasted a link for that in the chat. So you can see these different fragments, fragment 6, fragment 3, whatever, taken out of order in all these ways. You can at least get all of those in context, so you can understand the sort of, I won't say broader argument, because we only have pieces of the argument. It's already been picked apart, and many of these things only occur as quotations in Diogenes, Laertes, Lives of the Famous Philosophers, and so on. And so we don't know if we have all the connecting tissue between one piece and another, but many of them are continuous things, and you can at least know, why does he start with fragment 8 and then, fragment 3 and then go to fragment 8 and so on? What's in between? If you want to know all that elementary context things, that can be useful. It's in the chat. But in terms of broader context, I mean, one of the things I'm going to bring up when we get to the actual substance is the degree to which Heidegger is reading Parmenides as a figure of his age, as a typical Greek of his age, and thinks that because eon means this to the Greeks, and because logos means this to the Greeks, and physis means this to the Greeks, that is what they mean to Parmenides. And that is dangerous to do with a thinker of the originality and paradoxicalness of Parmenides. Parmenides is a father of paradox. He's the teacher of Zeno, was the inventor of the proofs that motion is impossible, which is a problem is that Parmenides set him to go out and prove. Right? He doesn't think things just because it was the common sense among the Greeks. He thinks things which are meant to be shocking and paradoxical and striking to the Greeks around him. He's disagreeing with them in various ways, and he also has particularly sharp disagreements with particular thinkers within that. Whether or not he's reacting to the same sort of arguments from others. So anyway, just take with a grain of salt the idea that Parmenides is just another Greek from the age. There is variation within the time among the thinkers, and we have to tease out the ways in which Parmenides is closer to some others in tradition sense than to Heidegger, and Heidegger is closer to some others in Parmenides' own time than he is to Parmenides, and that can change how well he understands him. I think that from this book, it's clear to me that of the thinkers we're considering here, Heraclitus is the one closest to Heidegger's own thought. Anyway, we'll can bring that out later.
Yeah, Bella kind of brought up the same thing. He said we have to be very cautious that we end up looking through the lens of Socrates, as he put it, back at these people, and he said that's something we need to be very careful about.
Well, the lens of Socrates is one thing, but I mean, and Heidegger early on brings up like three different traditional takes on Parmenides, a sort of commonsensical one and a modern philosophy one culminating in Hegel, and then an ancient one coming from Plotinus, who is influenced by Plato. But in all that, yes, there's a warning of are you just seeing a later problem that wasn't there for Parmenides and projecting it back? We can be doing that too. Heidegger can be doing that too. And it also can be the case that some of those people, some of those later thinkers, had more affinity for Parmenides than we do, right? Plotinus in particular may have more in common with some of the thoughts of Parmenides than either Heidegger or Heraclitus do, right? So we'll get to that when we get to the substance, but yes, here be dragons. There is variation. Context is useful, but mostly so we can make distinctions among the voices and arguments, and then assess the claims each makes. Any other first reactions or?
No, just amplifying the same thing you said is again, we're working from fragments, and some of the other people who came little later than Parmenides were working with a little bit more material, which we don't even have. And so I needed to get it. That was a huge part of the context to try to get is we're kind of trying to amplify a fragment of the mirror, and that was what I needed to get a better footing on, and so it was a worthwhile endeavor in that sense.
Cool. All right, Joe.
Well, my first reactions are quite shallow, especially compared to Craig and Pete. I found my whole overall feeling is that I'm not really sure I understand at all what Parmenides is saying. I found it very confusing, even reading the English words. But when I'm reading a sentence and a Greek word is plugged in there, the meaning about which I really have sort of fogged over, and I have no place to go back to recapture what that word means if I just fit something in that makes sense. And so I felt very frustrated reading through the whole thing. And so as a result, my focus became less intense. So I think I learned a lot less by reading than I should have done. I'm here to listen because I think you guys are going to teach me a lot more if I listen to you talk about it than if I tried to read it again.
Yeah, fair. But I mean, honest befuddlement is a good first reaction to something and recognizing that it's going on. Parmenides is a hard thinker, and a lot of the people who translate him don't make perfect sense out of him because they don't really understand him very well, because the thoughts he's thinking are often over their head. and his language is also terse and archaic, and so on. You have to sort of read it philosophically and think into it to know where he's going. Heidegger does try to do that at times, but Heidegger is also sometimes surreptitiously, sometimes consciously, bending him in the direction of Heidegger's own thoughts, which he's often getting from other things he thinks the other Greeks around are thinking, things he sees in the language, things he sees in Heraclitus, things he thinks are true, right? He's more inclined to see something that he agrees with and something that he disagrees with. But I at least have my own reading of what Parmenides is about in these fragments and in general, and I'll give it, before we're done, and try to give a line by line translation of the two pieces in my own philosophical terms, and bring out some of the places where I see disagreements happening. But it's no question it's challenging, and in even a short text like this, there's like 7 voices to take care of. There's Heidegger, what Heidegger says Parmenides is saying. He gives 3 different examples of traditional understandings of it, which is him explaining those other traditional understandings. And then we have, our own take on, Parmenides independent of what Heidegger says about him, and our own take on Heidegger independent of what he's trying to say about Parmenides, right? So there's at least 7 different, chattering voices in the room, and keeping them all straight is exactly one of these context exercises Craig was talking about. But I think it's valuable to do that. It's valuable to wrestle with it. There's a thing at the end where he says, readings of Parmenides are never over because it's so rich. I think part of that is him saying, I don't think I nailed this one. So if Heidegger, teaching lecture courses on it after multiple seasons studying it, doesn't think he's nailed it, don't be surprised if you haven't nailed it after 2 weeks, right? All right, but fine, and we're definitely eager to hear your questions when we get to that part of it. Miguel, if you don't know the format, it's basically, did you manage to do the reading? Have you read this kind of stuff before, and your first impressions?
I did the readings. It was difficult. The chapter on Moira is difficult. I did try to connect with the readings in the Introduction to Metaphysics, but it seemed like the page given was not where Heidegger is outlining his different pathways.
Starts a little bit earlier. Starts a little bit earlier, but yeah,
it's a little bit earlier, and so I had to go back earlier to the 3 paths. But I was able to find that small section on Parmenides, and I was able to read it, and with some understanding in the Introduction of Metaphysics. I have some just mild grasp of the Moira piece, and but trying to see, in a way, going back to I think it was Craig point, it's one of the challenges I find is what is the underlying question that Heidegger is trying to follow, and it's not understanding Parmenides. He has an agenda. He has a question that is driving him to Parmenides, and I think it's hard to I think it makes it difficult to understand what he's saying about Parmenides when we're still grappling with what is the question that Heidegger is asking Parmenides.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a separate thing of what Parmenides himself, cares about and is saying, and then there's why Heidegger is going to him and what he's seeing in him or saying and saying about him. You're right that independent of that, there's also what Heidegger is trying to tell us about the history of philosophy generally, or about what actually is the case generally, philosophically speaking, his own position, so to speak. And in that regard, to some degree, Parmenides is a foil for him here, as any text he's talking about sometimes is. I think the place where that comes out the most here is the notion of the twofold that he talks about in this essay. That's definitely his own idea he's bringing to it, and that he sees as being the thing which is structuring. He thinks that that's structuring Parmenides' responses, something like that. But that's an attempt to understand Parmenides better than Parmenides understands himself, so to speak, by trying to understand a not fully enunciated problem that he thinks that Parmenides is reacting to, something like that. And we can get to that aspect of the interpretation later, there's no getting around the fact that that means that Heidegger thinks that there's something in Parmenides which is useful, insightful, something to think about, something that's food for thinking, something like that, but also has an element of error in it, has an element of on the wrong path in it. And whenever someone is making that claim about someone who you're still trying to struggle to understand in the first place, right? It's hard to sort out, is this something in Parmenides? Is this something that Heidegger hasn't understood about Parmenides? Is this something Heidegger has understood that Parmenides didn't understand? And so all the different voices we were talking about before now get layered in the who's claiming who is right about what.
That's right.
Yeah. So you just take everything and you square it, right? Yes. So do you, other than noticing those things going on and having the open question of what is Heidegger's motivation here, do you have other first reactions, or even just subjects you want to make sure we cover in the discussion?
Yeah, well, just there are many questions I'd love to explore, many of which you have already alluded to, but it's that notion of the duality, which is around the thinking and being question, which he talks about being the same, and yet there's a difference between them. And
so let's be careful here. So you're right that Parmenides is talking about being and thinking as the same, but that's not the same as what Heidegger calls the twofold. When Heidegger is talking about the twofold, he's talking about the being of the beings and all the beings. He's talking about an ontological difference kind of thing of being as referring to all the things that are, and being as referring to that thing which all the things that are doing, that is the act of being they are doing. And that distinction is, and the fact that those two get bundled up with one another and confused with one another is what he's calling the twofold. And is that connected to the problem of being and thinking? To a degree, but it's not the same problem. Okay. But yes, so there's at least twofolds going on, right? Because we have to have four, right? So, but yeah, sure, go ahead, continue.
No, that's it. I mean, there's so many other little pieces about, questions about the notion of the Moira, which you began to address, and again, what is Heidegger trying to get at with Parmenides, as distinct from Heraclitus? What is there that he's doing and trying to, has some intuitions about that, but no clarity.
Okay, well, we'll try to get some clarity, at least about where he's positioning all these people. It may help to realize, and we're coming to this after we just did, before this whole book, his essay from The Word of Nietzsche, God is Dead, where he had all these claims about modern philosophy and something like nihilism is an impassive modern philosophy that sends us back to the Greeks to wonder, is nihilism something which is true of Western philosophy as such all the way back to the beginning, or was there some place where it goes off the rails, something like that? And how recent is that going off the rails? And the general claim you get in Heidegger is that it goes off the rails very early. The initial claim could be with Socrates, it could maybe with Socrates or the Socratics, maybe after Plato or after Aristotle, maybe in the pre-Socratics themselves, somewhere between the earliest thought of the pre-Socratics and by the time you're in Aristotle, something like that, or maybe right after Aristotle. In some period like that, there's some diagnosis of a general eclipse of being speaking to man, something like that. That is the beginning of this giant history of Western metaphysics as a progressive unveiling of nihilism in a Nietzschean sense, something like that. So a bunch of these things about the status of different things in the history of philosophy are already in play before we even open the book, because of the context in which we came to it. And he's already raised those questions of, are there things in the hidden in early Greek thinking that we need to relearn if we are to something like set modern philosophy on a straighter path than it's on, something like that. And that comes up in our own reading this time, especially when he's talking about the assessment of Parmenides in modern philosophy. He gives the example of Leibniz to Hegel and how they read Parmenides. which is very much of a piece of how he sees sort of modern philosophy generally, and the issues Heidegger has with modern philosophy generally do come out in that section. So one way to think about whenever someone of Heidegger's stature is talking about pre-modern thought, one of the things he is always implicitly doing is criticizing the aspects of modern thought which didn't learn the lessons of that ancient thought. So there's always some implicit contrast here. So did Hegel learn everything there is to know about Heraclitus and Parmenides from them, such that we do not need to understand Parmenides and Heraclitus? All we need to do is read our Hegel. Heidegger would say no, but that sort of thing is an issue here, and that comes up as soon as he's saying this is one of the traditional interpretations of Parmenides, and then gives the sort of Hegelian one. So when we're talking about what's the question and what's the what are the stakes, there's always multiple answers to that, but there's always at least those in play, right? At least those questions of, is this school of modern philosophy, looking in the wrong place for, and that sort of thing. But fine questions. Jim, you want to did you manage to do the reading and first reaction stuff?
Yes. Oh, well, it was great. I have so many notes. It's just like, why bother highlighting? Because I had, it's questions. The biggest one, the unfolding, the unconcealing, and then I'm also trying to cross-reference all of this stuff with being in time and all the other things we've learned. I have one question. I've got a ton of them, but I have one that's stuck in my mind. I can't seem to reconcile it. It's been torturing my brain for hours, whatever. So we'll get there. Well, I think I'd rather wait. You usually wind up answering those type of questions. Okay. But I don't want to belabor that now, because I've already turned my brain into hamburger meat over it, trying to figure, does it fit it? It was law of identity. Does it fit in here? Is it a part of Dasein? Is it not a part of Dasein? Is it part of being? But wait a minute, you can't know being from unbeing or not being unless you know what the difference between things.
Being identity, Dasein being, self, being, thinking, what thinking is thinking about, all those sorts of questions. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and it's like I don't know which one needs to be there first, because for it to emerge, all I came up was maybe they emerge together along. Maybe identity emerges alongside Dasein or being, so that you can tell that there was something concealed that is no longer concealed, but then that's ensconced within time. So there has to be time passage for us to even have that experience. So that made me think, is he getting at that being is like a form, like a platonic form, because it'd be eternal? So what I mean? My brain's went.
Okay, I understand. The problem is you're absolutely right that all these things are in question and in play, but also each of the philosophies is teaching different things about them, right? So Hegel's answer to that question, or Heraclitus's answer to that question, is not Parmenides' answer to that question.
Yeah, he's like, here's three choices. I'm like, oh my God, I can't even really get my head around one of them. And you want me to?
Yes, we want you to drink the ocean, right? So
pick between the three.
But you're also bringing up the wonderful thing that, at the beginning where he says being and thinking are the same. It's not being and thinking the same. The first word in the sentence is same, but it's not the same of homolegen that we had back in Heraclitus. It's auto. It's AUTO. Automobiles move themselves, right? So the self in self-moving automobiles, that auto is self, but not self with any necessary connotation of the subjective psychological pole in modern philosophy, but self in the sense of like self-reference and identity and law of identity. So in Greek, iso means things are equal, and homo means things are the same, and homeo means they're similar with an E, but auto means self, means something like selfsame. So if we didn't have to worry about confusing the modern reader with all these associations of the psychological subject, we would just say self, right? The other thing to notice about the word, the auto word, is it's also the same word as tautology. There's just a T apostrophe in front of it, the auto in tautology is self-reference. Something which is true from itself is a tautology. So self and from itself is the root word here that's being translated same. And it's not the same that we got back in Heraclitus, where it was homo as homolegen, as same saying. So homo is closest to same, as in, you get the point. But auto is self, and the word here that is being equated is self. I want to just briefly mention the order of the words, right? We're talking about fragment 3. This is togar, auto, noen, esten, tkna. For self-same, thinking is, and being. That's the literal order of the words. And there's almost I will in a second. I just want to mention that in the and there's also an unbreathed also from the construction, right? So for self-same, thinking is, and also being.
Okay.
If that's not cryptic enough for you, right? That's why Heidegger immediately says, we need something to explain this passage to us. Okay, and that also, that's the construction, to K-N-A. The KAI is basically an and, but it's usually an and, which means an and that's an also, right? This and also that, this and that. So it's saying that two things are self, thinking and being. And it's saying the thing which is doing the is self. Self is doing is, and the is that it is doing is thinking and being. But the self that's doing that is not psychological subject self. It's just self-same.
Right. But the way he talks about what thinking is, we have to get into how that was. I loved how he did that, how he was trying to work that out.
We'll get to what Heidegger says about the thinking part, but I think it's fair to say that he's more focused on the being part than the thinking part. Heidegger, at least.
And don't get me wrong. I mean, I know I'm frenetic, but I mean, I'm excited. I mean, I'm enjoying it. The fact that my mind is blown is a good thing. Definitely not boring. Just really intriguing. I'm interested to see where it goes and what you have to reveal. I've already revealed a little bit there.
Right. So the fragment 3 is saying this thing that there's something like a self-same that is an underlying identity that is both being and that is both thinking and being. And I can put it to you that this is a thought which is very common in later Western philosophy, especially in all the idealisms. It's there in Hegel. It's there in Spinoza. It's there in some Indian metaphysics, right? It's not that. It is a very metaphysical thought, if you like, but it is a metaphysical thought that every idealism runs across. There is some underlying identity that is both being and thought-like. Now, when we get to the modern philosophy take that he describes, we can see whether or not there's a particular understanding of how that correspondence arises or comes about or what it is in modern philosophy that Heidegger is going to disagree with sharply and is going to think doesn't really understand Parmenides. And I think Heidegger's fair about that. But there are lots of idealist philosophies that would subscribe to the notion, each in their own way, that being and thinking are the same, because to some degree, idealism just is the notion that the underlying whatever of which the world consists is thought-like, right? It's the fact, if materialism is the idea that the underlying thing is material-like, idealism is the idea that the underlying thing is thought-like, right? Whatever that underlying thing is, but whatever, being is thought-like. So to some degree, that is being said here, but that can be said in multiple senses, right? You can understand that such a correspondence could come about lots of different ways, which is what's the reason that James's mind is going bonkers, because he's looking at all the different ways that you could arrive at that conclusion, and all philosophies arrive at it from different ways. Dan, question.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, but don't you think that what the mothers are doing, like Hegel and Spinoza and so on, is like they think that reason and being are the same, not thinking and being are the same. They trying to kind of move this thinking into to reason.
Perhaps, but I mean, if you look at someone like Spinoza, right, he will say thought and extensions are the two accidents of one substance. There's one underlying substance, which is the whole, is being, and is God, and it has the two attributes of extension and thought, right? That's Spinoza's, deistic mathematical idealism, something like that. You're right that some of the sort of later idealisms are not as, if I can put it this way, metaphysically dogmatic as that, right? They want to, link things more to how we understand or to some notion of psychology or something. But the thought in question for a Spinoza is not primarily his thoughts. It's primarily God's thoughts. And the only question is, how does he think God's thoughts? And he knows the answer to that. He does math, right? Because that's how God thinks to a Spinoza, I'm saying. But I'm trying to point out that this seeing an equation between being and thinking as a most underlying out of which to build the world is something all idealists do. They may do it in different ways, but all idealists, as a subset of schools of philosophy, are committed to the project of explaining the world from an underlying structure which is thought-like, right? And Parmenides is one of the founders of that tradition. He is squarely in that tradition, right? Okay, and you're right that the later moderns have very different notions of this. Leibniz will bring an appetite, and Hegel will make it the reason of the absolute consciousness, something like that, absolute spirit, not of the individual consciousness. You get all these different variations on that, but I'm just pointing out that there's still an underlying thing that they have in common. Okay. The other thing to notice here, though, is all of these things are stated with fors, and they're stated with claims about necessity and forceful reasoning from Parmenides. He's not just saying that these are things which might be the case. He thinks that these are borderline provable, and that the alternatives are borderline disprovable or borderline impossible. So he's not just someone who is an idealist in some loose sense. He's also someone who's so rationalist about it that he thinks that being is a tautology, and that the non-tautologist stuff that doesn't kind of logically follow from the structure of thought or the nature of being is mostly just illusion and wrong, which is why he can end up with some very paradoxical conclusions coming out of it. Joe?
Yes, I have. I've long had an idea that doesn't quite, almost fits. And I want to see if I can describe it to you very briefly, and then you can comment in terms of what we just gone over. Let me start with, I'm going to be talking about a table, but let me start by saying I'm more of a materialist. So I think that we're mostly talking about quarks and molecules and atoms and things like that. Mm-hmm. And the universe is filled with those. A subset of those are collected in such a way, and possibly with some design or intention by human consciousness, but nevertheless, a human being's looking at that pile of them, and they have this shape with the four legs and the flat top and stuff. And the recognition of the tableness of it is there. But it's also got all those atoms that's making it up, but it's real. You can hit it with a hammer. And so that looks like a combination of thought and reality at the same time, thought and being at the same time. Because it wouldn't be a table if I weren't calling it a table and thinking it as a table and maybe having a human use for the table. Mm-hmm. But it's the thought is the table, but the reality is all the molecules that make it up. And are these related as part of a duality?
So I understand what you're saying. I mean, a materialist, subjectivist, constructivist, let's put it this way, would say, right, that the table is a subjective, pragmatic human construct used to interact with large numbers of molecules at once in a way that is coherent to his plans or something like that. The problem is that the molecules themselves that he's interacting with are also such constructs. And the tower of they are. I mean, you know, what's a molecule? Can you? How many molecules? How many molecules you hit with a hammer? Right. Some molecules have definitely hit each other in particle accelerators, but they weren't hit with hammers. They were larger than particle accelerators, right? And as you keep going down the tower of the pragmatic human constructs, it's not obvious that it isn't pragmatic human constructs all the way down. That's the first point. The second point is
Berkeley. That's Berkeley's claim.
Well, Berkeley is a subjectivist idealist rather than a pragmatist in this regard. But sure. But the point is, you first have the question of, is there a place where you hit a bottom where you're no longer in the world of created pragmatic human constructs? That's the first question. And if you do, what are things like there? Materialists will claim that things like there are, you know, matter-like, pure energy-like. They go ask the physicists will say, actually, they are persistent states of fields, which is almost pure math. Just there, I'm not saying that it settles anything, but there are problems over there, right? Let's think about how Parmenides himself thinks about all that. He thinks that almost all of human thought, mortal thought, is like that, and he's distinguishing that as the way of mortals. This is towards the end of our section, where he says, so all names are as great as mortals laid down, trusted or made to be truth, becoming and passing away, being and nothing, and place changing along with color shining variously. All those things at the end of the passage are things which he is saying, these are all names. Human beings have laid down beliefs about them, which they take to be true, but they made all of them. And all of these distinctions that they're making are human-made names at bottom. And he's
like a mixture of Kripke and Nietzsche.
He's explaining that whole sphere of what he later calls those who treat being and not being as the same and not the same. That whole sphere of constructed conceptual thinking is the realm of mortals in which there is no reliable truth. There is just shifting opinion and endless contradiction, right? Shifting kaleidoscopic opinion. That's what he sees over there. And he's contrasting all of that with the place where things are absolutely sure, known, perfect, apodictic, tautological. Being is. That being is has a necessity to it that you will never find in any of your theories about colliding molecules. All your theories about colliding molecules are going to be pragmatic names you lay down that you may change tomorrow, and some experiment may upset. That being is will always be true. And anything you could deduce from things as certain as those tautologies will therefore stand forever, like granite. And all of the things you build in your towers of opinions are going to change every 5 minutes with fashions, right? So the contrast he's laying out between the way of necessity and the way of being and the way of the gods, which deals with logic and tautology and pure reason, we would say pure math, pure logic, whatever, pure metaphysics for him, right? Those things have a certainty to them that everything that's in the sphere of human opinion does not. And for him, the sphere of human opinion is very wide. The sphere of human opinion includes the fact that there is actual change, right? He does not consider that something which is proved by experiment. He considers that to be a matter of human opinion chasing ghosts, right? He has strong theorems that tell him the universe always has been, always will be, and never changes, that the truth is a block of granite. And in that truth is a block of granite in which everything is necessary, all the things that you think of as change, he thinks of as transitory illusions from looking at only a piece of the problem. So how is that possible? Well, if you have enough necessity in the connection between the before and the after, you can have what's called a Parmenidean block universe, in which all of time is always stationarily there. It's just the truth. Every trajectory that every molecule takes is from all time set. It's fate. It just is. It's just the truth. And there's no change in it except the appearance that you throw onto it by being deluded enough to think that that your categories are lining up with the things which actually are. But that's all just mismatches between your sloppy categories and the things which actually are, which are all necessary as truths in mathematics. That's the underlying Parmenidean view, is that truth doesn't move. Okay. That's why I said it's a paradoxical view, right? And there's no room in it for real history, real change, right, etc. All those things become illusions that the mortals experience because of their limited perspectives and their pragmatic concept nets thrown over things that don't actually fit the things they're throwing them over.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So what you just said about the truth doesn't move, immediately I thought of Nietzsche and his definition of truth as being something that's always moving, otherwise it's dead. And now my brain is further.
Fried,
so
yes.
I'm thinking, was he commenting also not only on the Platonic idea of truth by saying those kind? I don't want to.
Yeah, Nietzsche is siding with Heraclitus, and the whole sphere of becoming is real, which Plato calls Homer's army. Homer in the Sophist says there is a war of the gods, a war of the giants over being, between the party of change and the party of stasis. And the party of change is led by Homer. It's Homer's army. Heraclitus is its foremost advocate. It includes all the sophists like Pythagoras, all the physicists. They all believe that change is real, and maybe that only matter is real. And they're subjectivists in method and so on, right? And over on the other side, there's just Parmenides, right? And maybe a few Socratics, clinging around his skirts, right? Which is the party that believes that change is an illusion, and only being is. Right. That's the presentation you get in by the Parmenidean stranger in the Sophist about the gigantomachia, the war of the giants over being. So, and that may be a little bit partly distorting or doxographically simplifying the conflict between these, right? But there's no question there's a stark difference here. Both Heraclitus and Parmenides have teachings about the untrustworthiness of the conceptual thinking of mortals. They have some areas of agreement on that. But to Parmenides, that extends to practically everything beyond some core truths of metaphysics. Dan, was that a stretch or a question?
Let me say, so the paradox is trying to reconcile the fact that both of those, at least to me, seem to be true, or I have experience of that. Some things seem to be like mathematics; they're just there, period, and you're always discovering more. But you can't, like, obviously, you can't have give me a piece of math. It's in, you can't have it, but you experience it. But then at the other time, I do, Nietzsche's ideas about knowledge being something that's ossified that you want to grasp and hold for your own need for comfort.
Right. I mean, Nietzsche tells us that truth is the kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live, right? So, but it's always error. And if you don't think there's any truth that isn't error accessible, then this may be the pragmatic fallback position, right? Parmenides thinks that there is truth of another kind available, right? And the question is, how far does that extend? Miguel has a question.
Yes, thank you. And I was trying to get into this discussion because this is fascinating to me. You know, one of the things that occurs to me is that yes, as you said, Jason, is that Parmenides does emphasize this permanence of things. The word, you know, there is a stability, and there is a very different sense in Heraclitus. But one of the things that I feel that, and even Nietzsche himself, with this idea of this unfolding of the self, but one of the things that I think is Heidegger is trying to make an argument that all of them miss something, and that is alluded to at the end in the issue of naming, because naming is very different than the question of perception, because the perception of beings, of things out there, is very different than when we begin to name them. There's something about our humanity, about a recovery of being, of humanity, that unfolds when we just don't just simply look at objects, but the names of objects. Something profound that about the development when we name things. And at the same time, in that process, what Heidegger is trying to recover is how being is also connected with the nothing, namely mortality, that we die. And that is where this issue of Parmenides' permanence or Heraclitus' continual unfolding, even Nietzsche's miss out on something very profound that Heidegger is trying to get at, which is a forgetfulness of being that is connected with mortality, with finitude.
You're right that
still,
you're right that he comes out at the end of the essay. I do think some of those things are engaged here, but there's a separate question of first of all, there's the question of how deep the language aspect of this goes, but there's also the question of how deep the human aspect of this goes. And this is a great segue to the first three types, right? The first, when he gives the traditional understandings of Parmenides, if you don't mind derailing a little bit, the first of them says, well, he's saying that being and thinking are the same because he's trying to say that thinking is also a being. It's a very commonsensical way of trying to put these things together that thinks that Heidegger is saying something relatively simple, and it may be easy to, step past this and ignore it because it seems like so shallow an opinion. But why would someone say that? Someone would say that because they think that what being is and means is obvious, and that the only question is whether or not anything like thinking arises to the status of actually being a being. Maybe thinking is too ephemeral and unimportant and fleeting, and to be anything other than an illusion, right? But Parmenides is there to tell us that actually thinking is a being too, right? So, and Heidegger reacts to this, very dismissively, right? He says that the critical part of this is that it gives us an opportunity to say, Parmenides never says that thinking too is a being. He says thinking and being are the same, right? He's not equating thinking in that with lots of other things, which are sort of obviously beings. So that's not how he's arriving at the thought. True. But there's another underlying thing going on there. The people who are making that claim think that being is a word. They think that being is not the thing which Parmenides is using it to refer to, which is either all beings that are, or the act that they're all performing, or maybe those two together as an ontological difference bound together in a twofold, the referent of the term. But they think that it's a word, and they think that Parmenides rather is telling us something about the word being, right? So are these philosophers only talking about the words, or are they talking about the things that the words are about? Okay. The naive people mentioned first think you can substitute one for the other. They think that you can use the words in place of the beings that they stand for, right? And why, right? Partly because they haven't given much thought to the depth of language, as the way that you were talking about, right? They have a very conventional understanding of that. Partly because they think of all these philosophical questions as occurring just as questions within language. they don't think of them as questions about the nature of reality. They think of them as questions about how people talk about things, right? And Parmenides is someone who is saying something different because he's someone who talks about things differently. Okay, all the philosophers think, I think this is fair to say, you cannot reach philosophical questions if you understand these things as just thinking about words or terms in that sense, right? You have to be able to think about the things to which they refer. Does that work? That raises the question about how much being there is in words. The second version of this, the second, when he gets to the modern philosophy version, which is a much deeper one, one much more likely to be listened to sympathetically by his audience or by modern people generally, they are also doing a little bit of this because they think of the being as being something that the object has, and they think of the object as being what stands over against the mind, and they think of being as something which the mind affirms of the object that it perceives. So they're tying together this perception and an affirmation of a mind. But that is about, again, a word. It's what the word, it's giving a meaning to the word being, or what the meaning of the word being is an affirmation by a consciousness about its object that it is, right? So what's going on there? What's going on there is, this is to Heidegger too subjective to reach the way being talks to man, something like that. It's just man talking to being, or even talking about being. But at bottom, it's talking. And that's what's missing about it, or missing in it. The modern subjective philosophies are understanding everything about being from the standpoint of a coherent body of thought, or a coherent body of language used to map or navigate the world, which isn't the world, right? And because they do not address that slippage, right, they're always just talking about language, or they're always just talking about a subjective map. That's the kind of criticism there of the second argument, the Hegelian argument. The Hegelian thinks that he thinks that the actual external reality is always something which is constructed by the mind, and therefore he is living in a world of the projections of the mind, and the issue is just to bring them into correspondence and to have your experiences and become coherent enough that they're matching reality, and that's what absolute consciousness is. Absolute consciousness is true consciousness, which is when your subjective impressions and the external objective reality coincide, something like that. That's the sort of Hegelian rationalist way of putting these things together, but it's all adjustments with the feedback of experience made in a system of thought. It's thoughts that are moving around. Craig, question?
Question, just a comment. What comes up there is the classic phrase, the map is not the territory.
Exactly. And that's the criticism that Heidegger is making of the when Hegel thinks that he has understood everything in Heraclitus, and that Heraclitus has nothing to teach him because he has everything that Heraclitus had right, he has taken up into his ethics, but Parmenides didn't, not his ethics, into his logic, but Parmenides didn't have speculative logic yet, so he didn't find anything really to use there very much. But Heraclitus is very amenable to Hegel, and he can reproduce everything that he has. That attitude that Hegel has presumes that Hegel fully understands everything that Heraclitus has when he has the same territory maps that he thinks Heraclitus has, right? Dan, question.
Yeah, I was thinking of we have this kind of like being and permanence, and I think Heidegger is trying to distance himself from this. Like being is not permanence. It's how beings present, like how they present to us. So it's a way of presenting, and thinking is one way that the being present to us, for example. But we mothers, we think like in terms of permanence, and we think like, I don't know, substance. Substance, it's there, it's permanent, and that's kind of we trying to identify that with being. Or reason is there forever, and that's being. But I think that's kind of like, and Nietzsche also confused things a lot with his being and becoming, when kind of try to say being is what's supposed to becoming, but Heidegger is not defining being that way. It's staying away from this concept like permanence. It's presence.
So you're absolutely right that Heidegger is all about taking being back to the phenomenal evidence of being, and that includes the idea of an arising appearing, and it includes an idea of present to mind, both as ways in which being appears, and that appearing aspect, appearing and in presented aspect, as being sort of the root phenomenological evidence of being, so to speak. And however, that doesn't mean that everyone in this tradition agrees with him on that point. Right, that is itself a based upon a kind of psychologizing of what gets to count as being, and that psychologizing might be it might have a basis in an understanding of language. It might have a basis in an understanding of existence as being there, or something like that. But it is still not the same sense of being that you get in a Plotinus, for example. And Plotinus may be closer to Parmenides on this than either is to Heidegger. Heidegger does want being to be something which is saturated with time, as an arising appearing, as an ongoing event, all those things. Yes. But and that is going to root him in something like phenomenal evidence, right? But for Parmenides, phenomenal as evidence is the way of mortals, in which there is no reliable truth. It is the shining appearing of the things changing their colors, and in which things go every which way, and everything turns back upon itself and all is contradiction. To Parmenides, leave aside to Plotinus, and the Parmenides repeatedly refers to being as the unshakable heart of well-rounded truth, the same in all directions, right? And he says, never is nor shall be, and these sorts of things. He uses all this permanence language. That permanence language is not something invented by moderns. The permanence language versus the temporal language is there diachronically in the Greeks. The change people like Heraclitus and Homer are all talking about, and for that matter, the subjectivists like man is measure all things, Protagoras, that we saw in Theaetetus, right? They're all on the appearance, perception, and change side of this question, but Parmenides is not. And the whether or not the meaning of being is something like permanence, the meaning of being is something like appearing, is an issue that they are fighting over, right? You're right that Heidegger is on the Heraclitus side of that divide, but that divide is not an ancient modern divide. That divide splits both times. But okay, but useful to point out that is going on. I think this is one of the reasons why Heidegger more readily connects with and understands Heraclitus than Parmenides. Some of the things that Parmenides is saying here are things that Heidegger doesn't agree with, doesn't believe, and therefore doesn't even see. He's making claims that are, so far from what Heidegger thinks as true that he doesn't grasp them. He doesn't see that Parmenides is even saying them. Now, Parmenides may be saying them because they're wrong, maybe charitable to not see them, whatever, but Heidegger is not pointing them out. And he's seeing instead Greek understandings of being that are classical Greek understandings of being that he's getting from the words themselves, even in Parmenides, and thinking that must be his experience of it. He must be experiencing being from the notion of physis as arising appearing, right? Because he's writing a book on physis. But in his book on arising appearing, what does he tell you about being? He tells you it never changes, right? So that's not simply an arising appearing. Parmenides' fundamental claim about the arising appearing is that, and this is something where there's going to be a point of contact with Heraclitus, it never sets. It's eternal. So Parmenides is in an eternal world, and he'll tell you that directly in some of the fragments. And even Heraclitus will say that the being that he's talking about is something that never sets. And for Heidegger, it does set. Heidegger will also tell you that in the three ways discussion, that of the three ways, we have to take them all, right? The manly thing, the human thing, is to bear all the different ways, the way of truth and the way of mortals, and the way to the altogether not. But that's not what Parmenides tells you. Parmenides tells you not to take the way to the altogether not, which he says, by the way, doesn't lead to the not. Doesn't lead to the not because you can't get to the not. Not is not available for getting to. The not that you can allude to in language is not the real not, according to Parmenides. So the point that I'm making here is the things which Heidegger is telling you to take away from Parmenides and do as a result of what Parmenides has said, and things that Parmenides is telling you to do are not the same thing. Heidegger is not Parmenides. Okay. Pete, thoughts, questions on any of this? You're on mute.
What's that? You're sending me something?
I'm not sending you something. I was just asking if you had thoughts on the stuff that I'm claiming about the differences between Heidegger's thought on these things and Parmenides' thoughts on these things. Am I wrong that Heidegger is disagreeing with Parmenides here? And
no, I don't think so. It's not that Parmenides thought something and now Heidegger's rediscovering it.
Right.
I think Heidegger has a new take, but he's finding traces in Parmenides because Parmenides is before metaphysics covered it up. So it's still available to Parmenides in a sense, as with Heraclitus, and he makes the connection with the logos being gathering here as he did with Heraclitus.
He does, but the reading gathering in it, the place where he's seeing gathering, the words that Parmenides himself is actually saying is, he says something like, needful it is to both say and to think that being is. And the Legen and the no in there, Heidegger translates as, gathering and thoughtful attendance or something like this, because that's the way he wants to translate those words. But it's not clear that's what Parmenides means by it, right? Parmenides is saying you have to say this and think this, and he'll even say, not only can you not think the altogether not, you can't even indicate it with words. You can't even talk about it, right? Parmenides thinks that the way to the altogether not is barred for reason. You cannot present any evidence of the altogether not, and you cannot even indicate it with words, because anything you can indicate with words is not the altogether not, right? So he has a very strong injunction against considering the non-existence of the meon. That, by the way, is an injunction which, in the Sophist, the Parmenidean stranger, he breaks. This is the famous Platonic break with Parmenides. He has his Parmenidean stranger say, Parmenides tells us not to do this, to not talk about the not being, but we're going to talk about the not being. We have to, because we're on the way of mortals, more or less. So he talks about the meon all through the Sophist. The problem the Sophist brings up is how is falsehood possible, right? So there has to be something like the meon. But none of that is there in Parmenides yet. In Parmenides, he's just saying you cannot consider the nothing at all, and Heidegger says you have to consider the nothing.
Okay, so there's something else that Heidegger is pointing out was available to the pre-Socratics is physis, that things rise up for Dasein rather than humans finding themselves in the world of things and then understanding the things based on knowledge or memory.
Yes, that is in fact the characteristic understanding of the meaning of physis for the Greeks. But Parmenides is not a typical Greek. You have to look at the very end of our passage, right? The passage at the very beginning of our. The translation he gives, I'll give you my own in a second. But after Moira bound it to be whole and immovable, for that reason.
What page?
79. Very last line in there, and then over to the next page. For that reason, all these will be mere names which mortals have laid down, convinced that they were true, coming to be as well as passing away, being as well as non-being, and also change of place and variation of shining colors. And I will gloss that myself as the previous part. He says there's nothing outside. There's not anything outside of being. Since Moira bound unmoving and whole, or unmoving and whole being, entire being. So all names are as great as mortals laid down, trusted or made to be truth, becoming and passing away, being and nothing, and place changing along with colors shining variously. That's my more literal translation. But all of that is the same as saying becoming and passing away is just names. Mortals made it up. They trust it as truth, but that's the way of mortals in which there is no reliable truth. Parmenides is an extremely paradoxical thinker. He is not just saying because something appears, therefore it is true.
Right. So I'm not disagreeing that Parmenides is something unique to what he's saying.
Yes.
I was just trying to get what Heidegger is saying was available.
Correct. And what I'm saying is that if you wanted to locate a place where some closing off of that openness to the experience of physis as arising, appearing occurs, you could point to Parmenides as if you're one of the places where it happens, because he's saying it doesn't happen.
Right. So you could argue that, so Heidegger is arguing, metaphysics starts with Plato. And I think last time I was saying, well, really, it was already there in Pythagoras. And you could argue that Plato's also getting that from Parmenides.
If the that is something like being as permanence, or is something like appearance having an aspect of illusion, then yes, Plato gets that from Parmenides. Now, there's something to understand about Plato, though. Plato self-consciously understands himself to be deliberately going down the path that Parmenides talked about as the way of mortals, the way in which there is no true alliance. He's trying to find something like reliable truth on the way where Parmenides says there isn't any. Parmenides says there's this metaphysical, apathetically knowable truth over here about being and the one and a few of these highest categories of metaphysics, and that everything else is uncertain and opinion. And Plato says, okay, well, let's go dive into the way of opinion and mortals, because we're mortal. And we have to deal with the many. And yes, you're saying those are mere appearance, so I can understand that there's aspects of these which are mere appearance. But can we find anything that is reliable truth in the sphere of mere appearance and in the sphere of mortals? That's the problem Plato sets himself. He's understanding the problem as the one laid down by Parmenides, but he's looking for something like a stabler truth in the realm of what Parmenides had called the mere appearance. And the reason he wants ideas of things less than the highest kinds is so that there is something like the same reliable truth that Parmenides thinks exists for things like being and the one. Plato wants that to be possible about things which appear in becoming. That's what the ideas are kind of meant to do. They're meant to give something like the stability of Parmenidean metaphysics about things less than all of being. Now, maybe they fail to do that, but the point is that is what Plato understands himself to be doing. So is part of that the project of metaphysics? Maybe. It's certainly the project of projecting things as the true thoughts behind the world, the true machinery by which the world works, that are thought-like and that account for appearances without being the appearances themselves and without trusting the opinions that people have about the appearances themselves just from the fact that they appear. So what the Nietzschean would diagnose as the split between the real and the apparent world starts in Parmenides, and Plato radicalizes it. He makes it general enough that he brings it down into the world of opinion. He takes the split that Parmenides just made between being entire and the entire realm of opinion as being the real world and the apparent world, and the apparent world all being illusory to Parmenides. And Plato makes that real versus illusion world happen even in the world of opinion, appearances, change, time, all of that, right? So the Nietzsche, if metaphysics is the idea that there's a split between the real and the apparent world, then Plato is definitely an example of that. If however, it's something more like closing off of the experience of being, then no, I don't think that's what's going on. If it's something like not seeing being directly in the arising appearing of things, then maybe somewhere in between, because you have that in Spinoza and Heraclitus. You don't find it in Parmenides. It's half and half in Plato. So the question is, what are we diagnosing as this metaphysics that's supposedly the problem? If it's disagreement with being talking to you directly in the arising appearing of things, then anyone who isn't a Heraclitean is already in that metaphysical realm, right? But it's not obvious that that's what deserves a pejorative word, metaphysics. I don't know if metaphysics it needs to be regarded as pejorative in the first place, because all these people are doing metaphysics to me.
Right, and yeah, in this essay, you know, Heidegger's not dumping on metaphysics very much.
No, but he does have a higher opinion of Heraclitus than Parmenides in this essay. That's clear. There's ways in which he says some of these things are not apparent to Parmenides. Parmenides did not think this thing when he's talking about the essence of the twofold, for example. He does think that that was not thought. I'm thinking of this is on page 87. The duality of being and beings is something twofold, begins to melt away into non-existence. What takes place at the beginning of Western thought is the unobserved decline of this duality, right, etc. So
he's saying that it was still available for Parmenides to grasp, and Heraclitus was more sensitive,
yes,
to this. And then, you know, the usual his story in other places is then Plato kind of cuts off that access because everybody after Plato already takes metaphysics as literal, as, you know, what is going on. And you know, here with the twofold, he's saying that to Parmenides, the ontological difference was still available and in play, whereas once we get to metaphysics, being is forgotten.
So I understand what you're saying, but let's unpack what it means to say that the ontological difference is still in play for Parmenides, because the twofold that we're talking about here is not just being and beings, it's a particular version of being and beings where the being involved is the being of those beings. It's not some higher, you know, bigger causation. And it is something as simple as the act that all the beings are performing because they are, right? It is that there is all the beings, right? That is a category of things that are the aeonta, right? And then there's the NA that they are all doing. And the twofold he's talking about here is that simple, right? It is the simple all the things that are as the beings versus the what they're all doing because they are, which is the NA. And Heidegger is saying that the perception of those two as being both of those things is available to Parmenides, but Parmenides is still also the person who is moving you away from the experience of the time dimension of the second of those things. He's moving you towards the generality, necessity, and logical following aspect of tautologies about being outside of time because they're independent of time. Parmenides is the guy who says, if this thing follows from the tautology of the meaning of being, then there's no time that it requires in order to be, so it is for all time. And he has straightforward, you know, deductions of eternity from things like that. And that's the move that makes the living time element of the beings disappear as important. Joe?
Yeah, it strikes me that Gosh, my thought is fleeting. I'll come back to you. I'm sorry.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry. Pete, do you have reactions to what I just said?
Right. So in that, so Parmenides as trying to remove time or temporality from being is basically, you know, if he's not laying down the groundwork for metaphysics, he's setting it all up for Plato to do it. If we say, oh, well,
yeah, I mean, if the particular thing that Heidegger is concerned about, that he's calling the sunset of the appearing of being, is that the sense of being as a temporal happening, as a verb, goes away and it gets replaced by a noun, if that's the thing he's worried about, then the locus classicus of this move is Parmenides.
Right, but at the same time, Parmenides is telling us a poem about, I don't know, he's wandering down the road and the goddess
Yes.
Spirit comes along
Yes.
and explains stuff to the narrator and changes, the narrator's understanding changes.
Absolutely.
So,
well,
you know,
well, but
if
you're talking about the poem about the change of understanding, that's also the cave. The cave is the story of the reorientation, of the turning around of the person, right? There's no absence of the
change in the cave too. Yes,
exactly. There's no absence of the of the changing experience of changing perspective in Plato either. That wouldn't be a reason for thinking there's anything closed off, right? None of these people think that there is anything about the process of liberation and revelation and coming to understand philosophically that doesn't have the aspect of personal journey, growth, you know, biography, whatever you want to call it, right? What's at stake is whether or not the thing that they are understanding is something which is still saturated with the category of temporal happening and time, and maybe the mortality that Miguel was talking about, or is for reasons that may have to do with tautology and logic, trying to reach beyond that to something eternal, timeless, or more than human. Miguel.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, this is a very interesting and very complicated issue. One of the metaphors that sometimes comes to mind for me is the notion of a two-sided coin. And because we tend to think about, you know, the idea of thinking and being, you know, could be the two faces of a coin that are the same thing. So it's yet we think about them differently, and especially if we imagine the coin turning around and stopping, then we're just seeing one side of the coin and not the other. So we become there's a concealment of part of the experience, and you know, thinking, you know, includes being, but the two are connected because part of the logic that he's trying to get out with Parmenides is that, you know, without thinking you don't have being, but without being you don't have the possibility of having a thought. And so that's where the two are so linked together in a oneness, and yet they get separated. And the issue of time is also complicated because there is this thing that you that quote at the very end of that paragraph, what is it, paragraph 8, the fragment 8,
yeah,
where there is a sense of the, you know, and I think your reading is much more as if there is a kind of falseness with this idea of the coming and the passing away, which is an issue of mortality. But in my mind, the way that he is trying to get at is that there is eventually an unfolding. He doesn't call it a process, but that there is this notion of Moira, which is faithfulness, a type of faithfulness, but it's a coming together. It's a point at which there is a coherence where the coin is not just a two-sided coin, but just something that has a coherence to it that is no longer, we tend not to dance with one side or the other of the coin. And so there is a wholeness that goes back to a kind of totality of Spinoza, something that, it was very influential for Spinoza and Hegel and all that kind of stuff. And I think there is something around that in Heidegger, although he's not wanting to go back to Spinoza or Hegel, but there is this sense of how do you,
Well, there's definitely more.
recurring theme.
I want to slow down. So there's too many issues, right? There's definitely change still in Hegel. We can come back to the Spinoza part, and we can come back to the wholeness part. I want to give Craig a chance though to jump in first.
I just had a quick comment. One of the things I found fascinating reading Robert Bella's book is the equivalent to the allegory of the cave being found in Chinese and Indian in the same transition into the axial age.
Okay.
Gave the references to him. So he sees that allegory of the cave as one of the fundamental shifts in understanding that led us into the next understanding. And I had never considered that the allegory of the cave was almost in a sense a little more archetypal and not just solely left to what Plato wrote.
Oh, I think it's definitely archetypal, and it's not just Plato. I mean, you certainly find it in all the Gnostics, for example, and not all of them were influenced directly by Plato.
Yeah.
So the more Eastern Gnostics, for example. So I'm not at all surprised that that's there as a broader thing, but it's going to take us a little bit too far afield to get into those culture things. I want to come back to Miguel's point about the am I reading a falling off or a falling away in the coming to be and passing away passage there? Yes, I am, but I am because it's there, right? It's there in the Greeks. The part immediately before it, and you're right that this is not something that Heidegger himself brings out, but okay, so this the Tata Nest in the very start of this fragment is the self or self-same is thinking, and therefore and wherefore is the thought. So the thought itself. So there's a connection between being and thinking there, but the connection between being and thinking there is that there is no thought without the being that is the thought is of. I'm going to disagree with you partly on the point that there is no being without thought. That's the point where the moderns and Heidegger and even other modern existentialists might be at one, but Parmenides is not with them. At least as I understand it, at least if we mean human thought. There may be another thought than that. For without the being, the translation in utterance is given. Without the being, in utterance is occurrence to thinking. The problem is the in utterance translation there is not the only meaning of the word. The other meaning of the word is fallen. Is a sense of fallen into utterance. So without the being, fallen into utterance is occurrence to thinking. Neither is or shall be anything outside of being, sense of Moira bound, unmoving, and entire being. That's the word whole, but the word whole has an em in front of the word for to be, right? It's whole means being together, something like that. Unmoving and entire being or whole being. So all names are, as great mortals laid down, trusted, and the word for trust is just a PE in front of the word for poetry, for making. So to trust is the things that are that trust are the things that men make to trust. They're making them. They're not the same as the natural. Trusted to be truth. And that's where he transitions to becoming and passing away, etc. All of the things that he mentions after that transition to trust, are the same things he mentions in the other fragments as being the things one encounters on the way of mortals, right? And what is the characteristic teaching of the way of mortals? Characteristic teaching of the way of mortals is they treat the same and being and not being as the same and not the same. They are unimpressed by the notion that you cannot think of the not being, and they think of not being as just meaning not the same as. You can think of this as a diagnosis of conceptual thinking and thinking in distinction. But all of that, treating being and not being as the same and not the same, is Parmenides' formula for something like Heraclitean oppositional dialectical thinking. And it is not what Parmenides is counseling as a way of truth. It's what he's saying is the way mortals reason but what they're reasoning about is the names that they trust, that they have laid down as truth. He's pointing out the humanly constructed and merely trusted nature of the realm of opinion. And he's seeing all of that, what we would call dialectical thinking, as being part and parcel of that realm of opinion. And yes, he says that is the way of mortals. It's the way that mortals have to reason. But that is not, for him, a great recommendation of it. It is something you have to experience. It is something you have to understand. But he is distinguishing it sharply from the divine way, the way of truth, in which there is true alliance, where the truths are necessary, right? You could say that conceptual thinking that only lays down concepts that it has made and trusts in them is a way of opinion because none of its reasonings have force. None of its reasonings carry necessity with them. And there's nothing more characteristic than in Parmenides than the fact that there are always these words for force, forceful, and can and can't do, and impossible, right? It's impossible to think about the altogether not, and so on, right? And there may be aspects of this which are very antithetical to Heidegger's temperament. There may be aspects of this that may remind you of a logical positivist, if you like, but it's definitely there in Parmenides. Parmenides is one of these guys who is saying, you know, the rationalist logic compelled to be true things are very different from all of the realm of mere appearance and opinion. So Miguel, reactions to any of that?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and I want to reflect on it a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I think that it's interesting that all the other pre-Socratics also have some of the characterizations of the realm of opinion like this. You find some characterizations of the realm of opinion somewhat like this even in Heraclitus, even though he is one of those dialectical thinkers. He will still distinguish how most men reason. But from what he thinks of as the truth available to those that listen to the Logos. There's another place in Parmenides where he talks about listening to reason, being persuaded by reason in a similar way. But this whole, it is almost characteristic of the pre-Socratics that the importance of all this reasoning about nature is liberation from the realm of opinion.
Yeah, at the same time, one of the things that occurs to me is how, one of the ways that Heidegger may be reading Parmenides is as someone who's trying to grapple not with opinions or thought, but the possibility of it. How is it that thought arises in the human condition, in the question of being? How is it that this notion of thought, perception, how does this arise, and how it gets constructed in that initial, I think they sometimes uses the notion of inception. How is it that,
so
in other words,
I have to slow you down for a second. Because you rapidly equated thinking and perception there in a way that Heidegger sometimes does, but there's no sign Parmenides does. None.
True. No. But I know it's clear that Heidegger is reading that, he's trying to, because to me, it's not so much what Parmenides says, but Heidegger is reading Parmenides.
I understand, but understand Parmenides and Heidegger are not the only ones in the field here, right? Heidegger, when he's stressing the perception-like character of thought, is referring to the modern notion that S is percipiae, right? That you get in Berkeley, for example. And he's also referring to the stuff that we saw in the first half of the Theaetetus when he did Heidegger and the Essence of Truth, right? Where the thesis, the whole first half of the Theaetetus is that being is perception, right? And that is shot down in favor of the notion that being is true opinion, which was also shot down. But we transition from being as perception to being as true opinion in the Theaetetus precisely because there are arguments against the notion that thought and perception can be lined up with one another. Heidegger thinks of perception as being critical to something like thought. He even speaks of noesis as intellectual perception as opposed to sensual perception. But he's doing that in part because he's arguing against the Socratic and Platonic position, which is that there's perception over here and thought over here, and they're distinct, right? When he gives the example of the third classical understanding of Parmenides, the one of Plotinus, Plotinus is saying the being that is being equated to known, is both known and that is thinking and being are both being distinguished from the sensible, from the sense perceptible. And that may be a reading back into Parmenides, things which are later more important to the Platonists, because Plotinus is a Platonist, right? But there's at least as much warrant for that, and maybe more, as reading back a notion of the twofold into the fact that Parmenides mentions eon or eonta, right? The whether or not known can be translated as perception is in play here. And it's in play here not just because we're trying to understand what Heidegger says about things, but because he's arguing against people like the Platonists who distinguish them. Does that help?
Yeah, and I think so. I guess in a way, the Noé, I read it the way in a way Husserl constructs that this distinction between noesis and noemata, which is basically an intentional act. So
Yes.
it's not a perception. I did use the word perception, but it's more, how is it that an intentional act arises, which has this duality of a noesis and a noemata, a noema, and that, but that noesis is
no, I entirely agree with you when we're at the level of Husserlian phenomenology, right? We're already in a way inside the human subject as consciousness, as the core thing that we're taking as the base layer of the reality we're investigating, something like that. That also is in play here.
And
right?
It's pre-perception is before perception. This is a more primitive notion than perception.
I don't know what primitive. It's a different notion than perception, but my point is, it's still a notion about the consciousness in Husserl, right? And it's not clear that that's what's going on in either the Platonists or the pre-Socratics.
True.
Because they're trying to think about this in a way that any modern would regard as a more objective way, if you get me. Thought is something that occurs, and to Parmenides, thought occurs because being supports it. When he says that without being, you will not find the thought, he's not just saying that you cannot think about the altogether not. He's saying thought necessarily has being support, or it would not be. Right?
But it's also the reverse is also true, that being wouldn't exist. There would be no being if there is no thought. There'd be nothing. It's just kind of like
this you find in the moderns, this you find in Husserl, this you find in Heidegger, this you do not find in the pre-Socratics. You do not find that thought in Parmenides. You do not find that thought in Plato. They do not think that the cosmic whole exists inside the human head, ever. The cosmic whole is divinely larger than all consciousnesses, except perhaps theological consciousnesses that may coincide with it. But without the theological coda, right, when you're talking about human consciousnesses, they do not think that the cosmos requires human consciousness in the slightest, right? And that is what distinguishes the Greeks as being, from the standpoint of all moderns, dogmatic objective thinkers in Kantian terms, and not critical thinkers in Kantian terms, right? They do not think that the whole is something that the human mind projects or that the consciousness creates. It's not a meaning sphere. That's only a map. And the thing which isn't the map, but is the thing that the map is referring to, doesn't need human minds at all. That's the most fundamental difference you'll find between the Greeks and the moderns. And yes, in that context, Heidegger is on the side of the moderns. these are great things to bring out. Great things to bring out. I wanted to give Jim a chance to ask the questions I know I haven't answered. There's other didactic things I'd love to go through, but I want to first make sure we're not missing something critical here.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm standing. Let me let me get that open. It's open. I just want to.
Sure. Your questions that we haven't addressed.
A whole bunch. Okay, so I'm going to try to get the thing I don't think that was addressed yet, and I think you'll be able to really help me through it quickly. I was stuck on. I have so many, but
first one.
First one is on page 79. I think that you've kind of gone into this in depth, but let me read anyway. And I'm quoting from the first part, the relation between being and all that.
Yes.
The question is, how does Heidegger's understanding of the relationship between thinking and being challenge traditional philosophies, notions of subjectivity and objectivity? I think you've gone out of that quite a bit, but is there anything else?
So in terms of
I framed that question.
In terms of Heidegger's whole philosophy, yes, but he's not talking about it here or bring it in here, right? The subject matter here is Parmenides on the point. Heidegger certainly has his own understanding of the relationship between thinking and being, which we kind of got at in that last exchange with Miguel. That he does think that thinking is attending to being and to the question and to the address of being, but being needs thinking. Thinking is the human capacity that when exercised results in the place or site where being can appear, and that happening at the peak level of real understanding of being is what deserves to be called history. Things which are just happenings that don't rise to that level don't really deserve to be called history in Heidegger's terms, right? The history of the unveiling of the truth of being to thought, right, is what he considers history. So he's giving a very exalted role and destiny to human thinkers in that. But he also, and this is a way that some of the ancients might criticize him, is contextualizing being into something which speaks to man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is in some ways, from a very ancient point of view, a reduction of being.
Oh, yeah.
Being becomes the man whisperer, if you get me.
Yeah.
And is that a reduction in the exalted role of a cosmic being that it's reduced to the status of the man whisperer? Now you can reverse that and say not necessarily. It depends upon but at first blush, yes. At first blush, there is something which is a lassoing being and bringing it down to the level of the history of man's thought that is still there in all the moderns, including Heidegger. It wasn't there in the ancients.
They just, well, they couldn't help themselves because that was the way they're trying to get at something that's so far removed from their time. And I'm in the same boat.
I don't know about removed from their time. This is a question of the status that they regard the being that they're trying to think about has in the whole. Dan, question.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think that it's a little bit too strong. They say that Heidegger takes it to the level of human being because or to thinking. I think he's more like taking, like, for example, he agrees that language, for example, he take it there, and that's beyond. It's across, like, it's not at the human level. It's above that. So and
not by much.
Not by much. Yes, it's action.
It's at the level of. It's at the level of something like human history or the human generality as opposed to human individual. I will grant, but it's still in what all of the Germans in the 19th century would have called the realm of history.
Yeah, and as in any action, when human is approaching beings as beings, like, I think that's like, then we the being needs us for language or action or thinking. As far as we do it when we approach beings as beings, then yes. But I think taking it to the level of conscience or to human subject level, I think that's too much. Heidegger is not going there.
Not the individual human conscious level. I will agree with you. It is more collective than that. It is more saturated with language than that. It is more historical than that. So fair. It's not the individual subject that is the level at which he thinks that this happens. Yeah, and by the way, that's no disagreement. That's the same as even in Hegel, right? Hegel has a similar attitude towards where the entity he's calling absolute spirit resides. It's a greater than personal, but still within history thing. Craig.
Yeah, quick trouble that I had with that, and maybe the same thing. I got the feeling it was very anthropomorphic, that it was all about human thinking, had nothing to do with animal perception, even as weird as plant perception or any other kind of interaction in being, but it's only what humans think. And I thought that was a little bit too centric.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue, well, two separate questions. The first is the focus on anything like consciousness too human-centric? And the answer is often it is. You'll say things in passing like the animal has no world, right? And things like this, right? And as a matter of the pure phenomenology of consciousness, right? You could debate that and say animals, of course, have worlds, or for that matter, artificial intelligence might have worlds. You could speculate about all that you want. This is going to broaden very slightly the category, but it's not going to change the fundamental ontological difference they have with the ancients. The ancients don't think any consciousness matters for the cosmos.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. That's what I was struggling with, was the modernist bias versus where the ancients were really at. And the cosmos
there's a few of the more idealistic and theological ancients who think that thought matters to the cosmos and vice versa, but that's because they're going to put some thinking off in the cosmos. They're going to have the cosmos think for them, right? The cosmos is going to think too, right? But in the absence of a cosmos that is thinking, does thinking, even as the revelation of being, matter to the cosmos? The answer is, for all the moderns, yes. For all the ancients, no.
Yeah, in the same sense of maybe not just as the cosmos thinking, but when you mentioned earlier about acting or having I forget what the word was that you used in terms of how they actually cause and the auto in there. There was very much a belief in the ancients that the cosmos had a certain
self-acting.
Yeah, they were able to function, and that's something that we've almost tried to eradicate too, in terms of the modern scientific view of the cosmos. It's just nothing but dead matter. It doesn't have a function the way the ancients did in the cosmos.
Yes, and leaving aside the live and dead, I mean the moderns know that the whole is active in the manner of a law-governed thing, maybe in the manner of a only probabilistically law-governed thing, right? But for the ancients, it was acting, moving, and alive, something like that. But both of those perspectives, including even some of the more objectivist scientists, materialists of the modern, still see remarkably little importance or weight on the sphere of thinking or history, right? This is a place where a modern scientific materialist and the ancients are closer to one another than either is to a subjectivist modern philosopher, right? Or an ancient theologian, right? The question is, how important is the status or role of anything that goes on in consciousness to anything like the whole? And the ancients were extremely humble in the matter, a humility that is only shared in the modern time by the most rigorous as to science and easygoing as to consequences, a modern materialist. Right, they were on that end of that spectrum, and from their point of view, all of the moderns are extremely hubristic about the importance of their thought to the world, right, as opposed to themselves. A lot of the insights that the moderns have about the importance of thought to history may very well be true of history, right? But that's history is this tiny little thing over here, right? Dan, question.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm reading now like that our mathematical universe, that book, and it's surprising how much, like he says, we humans doesn't matter, we don't matter. It's our conscience is nothing. And the same like the guys like from artificial intelligence and so on, they dismiss the human conscience, and it's similar with what you said. It's like with the ancient Greeks and with Parmenides, with everything is yeah.
There's, I mean, that moment is just not there, and you do find that moment in some of ancient religion, and you find it in a lot of modern philosophy. To their credit, some portions of modern philosophy and modern existentialism in particular may restrict that importance to human life and human history, something like that. That's an intermediate position, if you put it that way. But Heidegger here is on the same, it's not quite the same as saying cosmic importance. It's of at least being importance. Let's put it that way. It's of being importance and history importance and meaning importance. What humans think next. Okay, and I think that one of the things that contact with a mind like Parmenides can do for us is make us recognize that something like that is a sea that we are swimming in, right? Because he's up there on the sandbank, right? So the fish doesn't notice the sea swimming in, and he has to meet someone who disagrees with him before he recognizes that all of us are taking water for granted. He's not taking water for granted. Among the other paradoxical things that Parmenides thinks, that's a way that he can help us. Jim, I only got to your first question.
Yes, I have more. But they're mostly, I kept coming back to the law of identity, and I'll give you the specific places where it started to, I don't want to say bother me, but cause a bit of a quandary. So first one was on page 88. He goes in and he has the long discussion about, of course, if we are of the opinion that the word the same means identical, and if we accept identity completely as the most transparent presupposition for the thinkability of whatever is thinkable, then by this opinion would become progressively more deaf to the key word, assuming that we have ever heard its call. It is sufficient, however, to keep the word in our hearing in its thought-provoking character. In doing so, we remain listeners, prepared to let this enigmatic key word alone for a while in order to listen for a saying which could help us to contemplate the enigma in its fullness. So my first note here was, I don't know how to reconcile that with the law of identity the way I understand it. And then let me just give the other two all about that.
No, not other two. We have to stick with that.
I meant it's all on the same. There's so three questions on the same thing. So you go ahead though.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So the what's being referred to here is what this auto is. What is this same that being and thinking both are, right? And he's what is he trying to say? He's trying to say if someone thinks that identity is just an equal sign, they'll read this sentence as saying being double equals thinking. They won't hear the word same at all. They'll just reduce the word same to an equal sign relation between two things, thinking and being, as the only thing the sentence is about. And the sentence is actually about three things. It's about this auto self-same notion, the being notion, and the thinking notion. And it's putting all three of them in relation. It's saying the same thinking is, and also being, right? So that's the first just almost grammatical point. The thing he's objecting to in the first part is if someone thinks that because they understand what auto means as identical, they can treat it just as an equal sign, almost as an ISO, and they just write being equals thinking in those.
I see. Okay.
And that he's saying that translation is going to miss the depth of the saying, right? It's going to oversimplify the saying in a way that's going to miss the point, because the point was trying to link up being and thinking, not directly to one another, but both to this same, right? And by linking them both up to a same, it's, you know, a little bit like the two sides of our friend's coin, right? You know, he's saying that it does have both those aspects, but the same is what each of them is. There is a same that is an underlying, that is the being, that is also the thought that conforms to being, and the thought conforms to being because thought needs a being to be about in order to be a thought. You can't think about things that aren't. You just can't. Thinking doesn't manage to make contact with non-being. So because thought requires being in order to be, it has a support in being, there is a relation both have to a same. Now, that same also has a meaning here in almost the logical sense, if you pardon the expression, right? All the truths he's pointing to are tautological ones. When he's trying to tell you something which is absolutely necessary, he says, being is, deal with it. You know, you can't get away from that. It's a tautology, so it's true, right? There's not going to be a time when it wasn't true. There's not going to be a future time when it's no longer true. Tautologies are and are true, right? So those are the kinds of things he's pointing to here. So you're not going to hear them if you replace them with a trying to understand it as a law of identity and putting equal signs between them, right? Yes, he's saying that there's a correspondence between being and thinking, but both of them are a correspondence through this notion of the same. And Heidegger wants you to hear that same and wonder what it is. What is its status? It's not simply thought, right? Or it would only be one side of the relation, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be something which is relating them. I don't know if that helps, but that's what I read from that paragraph. Are there other questions on the same thing here?
Yes, and I think maybe I started to get where you are, but of course I phrased it a little different. At the bottom of page 90.
Yes.
And the beginning of page 91, but start with bottom of page 90. Read that little section.
The no one taking heed of, is that where you are?
No one taking heed of what is
and what it takes up
or something set. Let me just make sure I have I can see the whole thing. I want to see you, but I have to pull this out so I can read it. There we are. Taking heed of and what it takes up are something said, something brought forward into view, but where Parmenides says, blah blah blah, in the duality of presence. Yeah, in the duality of presence. Thank you, presencing, and so what
slow
is.
Down. Oh, sorry. The thing to understand here is the Greek there is saying in the beings, and it's Heidegger's gloss that in ianta, the word, a duality is referred to, a presencing and what is present. The duality part there is being brought in by Heidegger, right? Parmenides is saying, where is this taking heed of, right? Where is this something brought forward into view? Ianta, right? So beings, that's where it's happening. And Heidegger is saying, if you're seeing it in ianta is this double word that sometimes refers to all the things that are, and sometimes refers to what all the things that are always doing that makes us call them being. They're doing the being thing.
Yeah.
So there's two references of the word, all the beings and the being thing they're all doing. But the fact that both of those notes are there in the word ianta is something Heidegger is pointing out, not Parmenides.
Okay.
Parmenides is just saying the word ianta, and Heidegger is pointing out to you, that's a word with two senses. That's an ambiguous word that splits the difference, the ontological difference, and doesn't tell you if it's talking about all the beings or it's talking about the being of the beings. So Heidegger is trying to underline that the term that Parmenides is using to refer to where this no and taking heed of occurs, it's happening in the beings or it's happening in being. He's saying it in an ambiguous way where it's not clear which side of the ontological difference he's referring to. On its surface, the Parmenides is saying in the beings. It's not emphasizing the being of the beings. He's not saying in a here. He's saying ianta, or ianti, but okay. But I want to distinguish there between what's Heidegger might be right to be pointing out that's ambiguous, but he's the one pointing it out. It's not that Parmenides said something there in the untranslated part of the Greek where he mentioned three things and distinguished between them. He didn't. He mentioned one thing, And Heidegger said that one thing he mentioned is ambiguous. It has both of these senses. Does that help?
Yes, yes. I think maybe the analogy I gave was back to music is you have a note and a rest, but you need the two of them to have the music. It's like they're not separate. They're a part of the. I know it's a crude analogy, but
I get it. But the thing he's thinking of is in a way simpler. He's talking about the difference between the noun and the verb, the things that are, and the are-ing that they're all doing that makes them things that what are, because they're all doing that are-ing thing all the time, right?
Yeah.
The are-ing thing they're all doing is one sense of being, and the all of them being are things is another sense. One is extended and the other is conceptual essential, right? And the point is that conceptual essential is seen in each one of them. It's not factored out of all of them. In each one of them, you can see it doing the are thing, right? And the fact that the are thing is an arising appearing in each of them is what Heidegger is always stressing, is the phenomenological sense of being, the sense that goes back to our experience, right? And the replacement of that sense of the are-ing of things in the things that are, to just using it to refer to the wide expanse of all the beings, that's what he sees as the falling away of that sense of presence, that sense of experienced presence. Presence as an action, right? Something that things do. I have my own theories about part of where Heidegger gets this emphasis. I mean, it's a characteristic emphasis in Heidegger, but that distinction between the essence of something and the act that it performs, that's Aquinas's most famous distinction, right? Existence is the act that the being performs.
Yes.
Right. So the point is that there is an element of that scholastic distinction in this emphasis in Heidegger, but it's also just part of his general thing of after trying to go back to the phenomenological evidence. He wants to be able to distinguish the intention of the mind when it experiences the present thing, and the intention of the mind when it experiences the present thing is that the act the thing is performing is distinct from the thing which is performing the act, and it's not just I took all the things which I see around and I divided them through by what by what they have in common. It's not a lowest common denominator of things. It's an immediately experienced thing of the things which are present. Anyway, that's when he's talking about the duality of presencing and what is present, right? The presencing is that act of the things they're doing, and the what is present is all the things that have it, and that's where
what provokes
Heidegger,
the thought, right? That's the thing that provokes thought.
Yes, he's saying but it's also where the knowing happens. Where does knowing happens, right? And Parmenides says knowing happens in eon t, right, in the beings, and Heidegger glosses the place where thinking happens is not just in the things that are, but is in the presencing of the things that are, right? He's trying to get there to be that same notion of the living act in the knowing sense, right? The living act in thinking and the act that the present things perform by presencing at you, right, are linked, right? A Husserlian would say there's something like the base fact of available to consciousness or something like that, and a Berkeleyan subjectivist would tell you that they're saying S is percepe, right, to be as perceivable, right? But either reading of it corresponds to the evidence that you don't just see the things that are, you see that they are doing the being thing in your presence.
Yeah, and I think what I'm struggling to even find words to say is understanding the structure of Dasein. So I think I've got what you were just saying. The thing that I've been wondering about is something like Dasein, maybe Heidegger is saying Dasein must be temporal because it's sort of like I said, it seems like it emerges. As it emerges, I understand that I was provoked into thought by this same and not same, speaking and not speaking.
So leave aside the same and not same for a second. But I mean, it's not just even a provoked end. The idea is that the there being as the place or site where being appears is what is phenomenally experienced as the Dasein, as the being there oneself, not consciousness. Consciousness is a tower of abstractions made on top of that, right? The thing which is immediately experienced is the fact that beings pop out at me, right? And that I am the center of a world field in which being appears and shines at me, right? That's the base level of the phenomenal evidence, according to Heidegger, right? So we're talking about the structure of Dasein before we get to anything about how it might be that way, which is the sort of conditional possibilities questions where you get into temporality and all that business, right? Before we get to that, what could be underlying it that would make it be that way, there's just the bare fact of what's the evidence. The evidence is that being appears, and being appears to Dasein. It doesn't appear to rocks. And the Dasein is the place where presenting occurs to it. So yes, he's then going to go through a whole bunch of Kantian-like analyses where he asks for the condition of the possibilities for this kind of experience. Why would experience have this structure? Why would experience have moods? Why would experience have, this temporal fading away into the past? Why would, experience have this, directed intentionality, practicality that's always directed to the future? And I'm never trying to practically, wrestle with things about what happened 3 weeks ago, etc. Right? All of those things are going to be other things to investigate to discover the deeper lying structures of Dasein that make it take the form that it has, so to speak. And that replaces the investigation of consciousness as a kind of philosophical anthropology, if you like. But all of that is being built upon the base layer of the phenomenological evidence, which is that being is an appearing to man, or to the Dasein. Why does this matter here? So the issue here is to understand what this known business is that is being equated to being. And someone like a Berkeley or even a Hegel would say, of course, these things are equated because being is a meaning ascription that the consciousness projects onto the things that matter to it, right? As though what's starting first is the intentions of the consciousness, and the intentions of the consciousness go out and make fake things that things which it just trusts into existence in the Parmenidean sense, in the realm of opinion, that are fundamentally made out of its own purposes, something like that. So in that sense, beings would be primarily subjectively projected things, and that's what you get in someone like a Berkeley, right? And Hegel is going to mostly agree with that, but then he's going to say, and then when the person, or not even the person, when the whole society becomes intelligent, then its ideas correspond to the reality of how things actually work, and at that point you have actual self-consciousness, right? At that point you've arrived at actual truth or something like that. But again, coming from the subjective side first, right? I'm just translating some of the other philosophies into these terms. There are other ways of explaining what is going on there, but in those other explanations, known is not an immediate apprehension of being. Known is something which is a more faulty constructivist thing. It's more like a Nietzschean, error without which creatures like us cannot live.
Yeah,
right? And a lot of the other subjectivists. Dan, you had a question or comment?
Wait a minute. I want to one more thing to clarify on that. The way I guess I'm imagining it is being would be like an infinite plane. And then when we experience it, or let's say it reveals itself to us, as that happens, there's a simultaneous manifestation of identity, because before we didn't know, and then now we do know. So that helps us to distinguish between not knowing or experiencing being. Doesn't mean it wasn't always there. It's almost like it feels like it's built into its structure somehow, because you can't escape it. You know what I mean?
I know what you're saying, but I mean, this is getting at the issue of arising, appearing as uncoveredness, right? And uncoveredness is something that was already there, but the something that was already there was also covered. It was also obscured or obliviated, to speak pop culture. But that's where yeah. So it's going to take us too far afield to get into the ways in which
Okay.
seriously, in which the ways in which oblivion might be implicated there. But there's nothing necessarily infinite about the plane from Heidegger's point of view. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, I would like to mention something related to this, so the phenomenological understanding of being. I just finished the book, like Heidegger's book, like phenomenological reading of Kant, and
Okay, yes.
I found it very interesting there. Like, so Kant is having this kind of, he see the phenomena and he reads it that way, but then he comes back, like his whole background, you have this kind of, like, on one side is God, which God kind of he doesn't need to perceive beings, because when he thinks of them, he creates them. And then on the other side is the finite human being who needs to kind of is affected by beings, and everything happens. And I found it interesting, like Kant kind of like takes the entire discourse and put it on that finite side of the argument and build it from there. And it seems like the entire modernity is built on this kind of the finite approach to being. Like human is a finite creature, and God is on the other side, that it's infinite. And it goes back in a way to Parmenides, which it's God is there, there is the true, is the absolute true, and then there is our opinion. And I think my point is, I think that it seems to me the entire modernity started there with Kant, and continue to build on this kind of finite concept of human being, and took it further.
I'm going to partly disagree with you, because Hegel is also in this world and is influenced by Kant. And for him, yes, it's, it has the same sort of construction aspect that you get from from Kant rather, but it's going to extend to everything true, right? He doesn't think there's an outside, Hegel, that is, does not think there's an outside of what the transcendental consciousness can arrive at as true. So in that sense, a suitably generalized mankind, suitably enlightened, is already as big as truth as such for Hegel. So I don't see the same, we're only talking about the human perspective on the finite side of the finite infinite relation, which I agree is there in Kant. I don't find that same thing in Hegel. Hegel gets more ambitious than that, if you get me. So all the moderns aren't on that side of it. I would also say someone like a Spinoza is someone who, just like Hegel, wants the comprehensible reason to extend to the horizon, right, to the everything. Yes, he'll put an infinite mind of God on one side of the equation, but he does not think that he thinks that the only relation that the finite has to that is that it cannot know all of it at once, but not that it knows any aspect of it any differently, right? He thinks that when the mathematician thinks a physically true thought, he's thinking a thought of God, right?
Yeah. My point is, like, if some of them think that we can move to the other side, but my point is, like, I think that most of us, or the modernity, have that distinction there in the background, and we still work with that.
So, I mean, that distinction is, I think it's there from way back, but it's certainly made ton of by the scholastics. I think that distinction is, it's certainly true that it's there in many of the moderns. I'm just saying they're not all on one side of it. They're playing around with it. They're stepping over the line and making claims about either side of that line. But I agree with you that line is existent and important for them, right? Yeah, I mean, in the scholastics, there was a whole theory of the things which are true across that line. That was the theory of the transcendentals. Was the only things that were true for both sides of the line, right? That was the theory of the transcendentals, so to speak. Anyway, that's too far afield. I'm just getting at the point that there is a lot of deep philosophical history laid over making that distinction, making it important for thought. And all of the philosophers after that are reacting to that one way or another, even if it's to dismiss it. Sorry, did I miss anyone's comment? Was anyone trying to? I don't know if I ran over. I don't see a hand up, but everyone uses the hand up thing. If not, I'm going to go back to Jim's questions. I see that Miguel had to leave. Thanks for his comment.
Okay, but I hope you don't get annoyed or bored because there's sort of variations on the same. So I'll skip over.
If you have ones which are a little bit farther from the ones we've done, that would be great.
I just maybe it's more of a comment. Because I think that's been dealt with. I'll just have to grapple with this a little more on my own time. I'm just trying to understand the structure, so I can in my own, just my way of trying to understand what he's saying and how it is all constructed. So it's good what we got so far. At the end, he does the poem, but then this thing about. Well, I mean, it's a great way to end. I feel like it's one of the rare times ending something I felt, wow, what a great way to close things up when he says, death is not the end of the possible, but the highest keeping, the gathering, sheltering of the mystery of calling disclosure. The only problem I had is calling disclosure, like beckoning, summoning. It's more of like maybe term, but I know that's at the end and I don't want to jump too far ahead.
So I mean, part of this gets back to the point that Miguel was trying to make about the importance of finitude for Heidegger. And this is partly because he talks about it, that it's not a failing to have an unending dialogue. But the last lines are mostly just explaining what he thinks he is about, what he thinks he is trying to do. Why calling disclosure? Disclosure is, another word for truth or for truth appearing. Calling disclosure because it is something which he feels the thinker is called to, and it also calls the audience to the same thing. If you want more on that, the book "What Is Called Thinking" is on that theme. There's definitely references to the call in Being in Time as well, but "What Is Called Thinking" is the standard text on this. I mean, what am I trying to say? There's a pun, a play on words in that. What is called thinking could mean, what do people, typically say thinking is. But what is called thinking is also what is thinking that feels like it is a vocation in the sense of responding to a call, right? Something like that. And that's what the book "What Is Called Thinking" is about. So this is written after that. It's partly a reference back to that. But keeping the gathering sheltering. This is going back to the idea that if Dasein is a place or a site where being happens, and if thinking is attending to something like the hints or intimations that being transmits to the thinker, then there is there's something like a piety of thought that is the mission of hearkening to whatever those intimations are and relaying them to people in language, right? That's the calling of the thinker as Heidegger understands it, right? So that's what I hear in those last lines.
So it's disclosure calling us to it.
We are being called to the business of the disclosure of truth, the unveiling of truth, as the sheltering of the truth of being in the gathering of thought, something like that, as something that we can transmit onto one another. And we always are doing that over the little bit of the way that we have seen or we are called to see. And that means that torch has to go to someone else to continue, right? It's not ours forever. It's not like we illuminate being forever. There's a torch race going on of people who have illuminated thought about the nature of being, passing the torch to the next person who can keep that little light going, so that being discloses itself here and there, right? That's the image there is the that's why it's in the context of death, not the end, because it's the passing of the torch, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that's great, because the thing I also wanted to say I liked about that phrase is it did strike me, and maybe he did this on purpose, the same way the first, in our last session, Heraclitus fragment was struck me as like, wow, that really hits me, and I don't completely understand why yet.
Right. I mean,
But
there's
it
a lot
has
of
that,
this,
you know,
there's a lot of that. I mean, some of that, some people will call it semiotical language, whatever, but it's also this this light metaphysics, the lumo natural, the lighting of being, right? All of this. There's a language of the light, is what I'm trying to say. That you find in yes, in the pre-Socratics, in the Socratics, here. You find it even in some of the early moderns, I would say. It's there in Descartes even.
It's in the Illuminati, right?
Yes, and the Enlightenment, yes. What is enlightenment, asked Kant, and did not stay for an answer.
But I do have to pee though. I'm going to pee my pants. So I'll be right back.
Okay, so a short break for Jim. I could get another cup of coffee. But do other people have comments or questions on those things before I could pause the recording for a few minutes?
We can pause, but I have a question about Parmenides when we come back.
Absolutely. I will pause briefly, and then will I pause briefly? There you go. All right, back from our break. Pete, you had a question.
Yeah, so this is going back to Parmenides and what was in the Introduction to Metaphysics.
Oh yeah, great.
There's the way of being, non-being, and the way of seeming. And it appears that in Parmenides, humans have access to the way of being, even though we're normally in the world of seeming. And it kind of feels a bit like Heidegger saying, oh, we're fallen in the world of inauthenticity normally. But does Parmenides say that we have access to the world of being apart from, we're surrounded by beings, and obviously we don't have access to the world of non-being, just in metaphysical terms, but we're in this world of seeming. Do we get access to the world of beings according to Parmenides?
Great question. So, I mean, he presents it as, yes, it is possible, it is available, but it is far from the paths of mortals. It is far from the path that most people take. So it is a rare thing that someone takes the path to the divine path to being itself. It is experienced as almost a revelation. It is experienced as something which is attending to reason, attending to truth, attending to the divine, attending to the necessary, and all the ways in which the mortal view, the way of opinion, intrudes, are ever present in human life, something like that. But it doesn't mean that there's anything inaccessible, closed off, or piled over with rubbish about the divine way. It's open if anyone seeks it, but few do.
So the revelation's a good word. I mean, I have revelations all day long, but are they hallucinations, or am I having access to being?
Yes.
How would I know?
So one hopes that the maidens who draw you there in the chariot and the goddess of truth who speaks to you will be able to reassure you on the point.
So the muse won't lie to me.
So partly just appealing to the poetic nature of what he's saying and why he calls it a myth. He calls it a myth in multiple places. But he also thinks that the divine way has force on its side in the following sense. He thinks that the reasonings for the divine way have necessity, they have an inescapableness to them if attended to. Always using words like needful. It is needful to this, needful to that. This way has no true alliance. This other way is founded on unshakable truth. There is greater certainty and force in the conclusions of the divine way than there is in the way of opinion. In the way of opinion, there is always uncertainty, there is always conventionality, there is always change. The what's the word he says? Palantrope. That's the word he used for it. Its ways return on itself. All of its ways return on itself. It turns back on every way it takes. It contradicts itself everywhere. That's what you experience on the way of mortals. Is that everything seems like it could be equally its contrary. If you are seeing a necessity that does not seem to have a contrary that is remotely possible, that's where the divine way is, right?
So in that sense, would then mathematics be divine?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, he's the paradigm rationalist, but he's not thinking primarily of mathematics. He's thinking primarily of metaphysics, but the number of propositions in metaphysics that he thinks have this certainty is very small. He doesn't think the number of propositions available on the divine way is huge, but he's also not thinking of, real analysis or even geometry. He's thinking of things like, that being is, and that the thought that being is necessary, and that without beings you will not find thought, and those sorts of things. Dan?
Yeah, isn't this the world of like Newton and the modern physicists? Like they talk that way, that they like Newton even have God there, and now the modern physicists, they have math, and they talk in these terms like everything is necessary. We got to the bottom of it. We can predict the future and so on.
Yes, I mean, and when he was asked about the matter, Einstein said he believed in a Parmenidean block universe, and that maybe Spinoza had it right and that sort of thing. But have a little tongue in cheek when you make those comparisons, right? Because that doesn't mean that Parmenides had exactly the same thoughts on the subject, right? What it means is that there is something about, go put it this way, necessitarian rationalism that has that sort of outcome. I think that most of the things that the modern scientists and mathematicians and so forth that tend to that view think about do not have remotely the necessity or the simplicity of the things Parmenides was thinking of. I think what they're thinking about, is from his point of view, way more contingent and way more constructed and way more saturated with opinion. But they have as much confidence in it as he had in his rationalism. What's the remark? Aristotle makes a remark about Heraclitus, that he was as convinced of the things he merely opined about as other people were of what they were able to demonstrate, right? But my point is that I don't know that Parmenides would endorse all of the towers of abstractions that a modern cosmologist, comes up with in his mathematical theory of metaverses or something. But that modern cosmologist, I'm thinking of Max Tegmark at the moment. He will come up with a single mathematical abstraction in which such universes as he believes can actually exist are necessary parts of this one mathematical object, right? So that's the same dream of a purely rationalist account of the whole, something like that.
Well, hang on. So Heidegger's response would be that in the modern world, the scientists are just in the world of beings. They're just measuring and making theories about beings. But clearly, to Parmenides, being itself was an issue. And that's what we've lost. That being itself has disappeared, and we were just concerned with the beings.
Yes, but the reality is that many of these scientists are not simply scientists, even if that's their day job. They're also metaphysicians, and they are, I think I remember there was a Scientific American had an insert with all of Max Tegmark's theories in it, and I said they should change their name to Metaphysical American, right? Because it was practically nothing in it was physics, right? But he definitely had his own notion of what being meant in that insert, right? Because the things which he was regarding as counting as existing in his mathematical sense, and therefore counting as existing in some suitably watered down physical sense, were so far from what you or I would consider as existing in a physical sense that he was Zeno had nothing on him, right? But
who's this guy, Max who?
Max Tegmark,
Tegmark.
Tegmark. The Mathematical Universe is probably his most famous book. He's a fun guy because he's a very self-effacing about all this. He'll make the most outlandish claims, but then he'll also, joke about himself for making them. So he has. I remember he had one place on one of his essays. He said, if you don't mind outlandish theories, go to my website and check out my completely bananas theory of everything. Right? That's a typical Tegmarkism. Craig is probably looking around for his Tegmark because he's got it ticketed in sorts of.
Can't find it.
Yeah. I know Mathematical Universe is over there somewhere, but whatever. My point is that there are plenty of modern thinkers who may have scientist day jobs who are engaged in metaphysical speculation. I think from Heidegger's point of view, pretty amateur metaphysics and very much metaphysics, not direct experience of thinking in the way that he's thinking these peak thinkers are. He would not take most of their theories in these matters as seriously as he would take a pre-Socratic. But that doesn't mean he wouldn't have an interesting conversation with them about the foundations of their science. He would, he obviously did that kind of thing with Heisenberg, and he would probably do the same kind of thing with a Penrose or a Tegmark or anyone like that, right? But other people, other moderns who famously had, thoughts on metaphysics like that would be Gödel, Gregory Chaitin, Einstein already mentioned, right? A lot of these people, they have they recognize they're being complete amateurs about it when they have metaphysical speculations, but they still do it. They're still interested in it.
Right. I guess I'm going to say they don't have a tradition or a school, so they're all going to school and they're all studying Newton, and now physicists go to school and they all study Schrodinger, but they don't all have the same philosophical background. So Einstein,
correct, but they typically have the typical amount of philosophical background they'll have a little bit of neo-Kantianism, they'll have some Popper on theory of science, they'll have some modern rationalism a la Spinoza that they don't know how true or not it is. They'll have some views on logic from logical positivism. They might have read Quine or something like that, and from that they'll try to see which of those things actually fits with what they think they're dealing with in their day job, and the parts of it that seem to fit they'll take seriously, and the parts of it that don't they'll throw out as just speculation, right? There's the famous joke about the three. There's a scientist, a mathematician, and a philosopher who are going to the dean, and they're asking for things, and the scientist goes in there and says, we need this whole giant laboratory, and the dean says, well, I'll take it under advisement, that sounds pretty expensive, and the mathematician comes in and says, all we need is a room and some blackboards and some waste paper baskets for our lousy ideas. And the philosopher says, that sounds much better, I'll get back to you. And the philosopher comes in and says, all we need is blackboards, right? So the only difference between the philosopher and the mathematician is neither one needs any elaborate equipment, but the philosophers don't throw out their bad ideas, right? Anyway, I'm just saying that's the level of at which many of these people will approach these philosophical questions. They will assume that the philosophy they learned in school, such as it was, to the extent that it corresponds with what they learn in science, is true. And to the extent it doesn't, they'll just throw it out. But that doesn't mean they'll be terribly sophisticated about it. Some of them do, get into some of things on epistemology in a reasonably sophisticated way, but usually not beyond that theory of knowledge kind of side of things. But I don't think that this settles anything about any of these philosophical questions. I mean, does the fact that such people exist mean that metaphysics or understanding of being are alive in the modern world? I think metaphysics, yes, but usually it's amateur metaphysics, right? I don't know if that helps. I wouldn't go looking to those people for the most philosophically coherent history of Western thought that's going to arrive at the view of metaphysics most likely to be true. They would need to be significantly more historically informed about what's already been tried and what the ideas have already been hashed over for that to be the case. They may have perfectly sound instincts, though, in the areas that they think about and they're informed about.
Right. So I think when Heidegger says, "Oh, modern scientists only deal with things," he's doing these broad strokes.
Yes.
To make a point to his students or in his class. Oh,
there you go. Yes, the philosophical problems of quantum physics. Yes, absolutely. I think about that a lot.
But at the same time, and so a lot of these scientists, are a lot smarter than I am and stuff, and have thought deeply about this. But a lot of them, they all seem to be, or a lot of them seem to be starting from zero and getting lost.
Yes, they easily can. They're not all starting from zero. Some are starting a little bit past zero, but they can easily get lost. They can easily also think they've got, a wonderful insight into things, and you dig into it and you find it's a really interesting shallow thought that some scholastic had, or that, whatever.
It can also be dangerous. I mean, like Boltzmann ended up killing himself, and arguably because of his understanding of his own discoveries about entropy and stuff. And
if he didn't, he'd be alive today. No way.
Framework, my guess is if or the possibilities there if he'd had philosophical development, he wouldn't have run into the despair he ran into.
Sure. I mean, sure. I mean, but this is true of, yeah. I mean,
and we get into
obviously
science. We have this caricature today, and could follow on from Heidegger. They just calculate, and I ran into this in grad school, and sort of have some questions of,
I understand what you're saying, but I mean, my own experience in this area is that there's lots of scientists who will at the party for public consumption, be very humble about the claims they make and not stick their neck out too much and say the very conventional things because they don't want to get into any trouble. But if you have a quieter conversation with them, with their hair is let down and a few glasses of wine have been exchanged, the interesting philosophical questions will come out, right? And they're perfectly open about those if you pry them. Not everyone, but a fair number of them are thoughtful about them. Some of them have thought about these things reasonably deeply. Others have not. I mean, when I think of if you take someone like a Gregory Chaitin, he had clearly thought about these things deeply, right? And
so I ran into this in grad school, and my distinction was, so I had a lot of I went to grad school in the 80s, and I still had a lot of European people. Like I did aerodynamics. And I had people who worked on the V2 and stuff.
Sure.
And they were all open to those. And it's like the next generation that was, don't waste your time, just calculate. This is the math. Don't be asking questions. We're teaching you the equations. Learn how to crank through the equations so you can have a job. But don't worry about these questions you're answering about. What's the deeper meaning here? Are there ethical issues and so forth?
Sure, and I think part of that is self-defense after a lot of these things got too heated or ideological or politicized, and so it's just safer to not have an opinion. But if it doesn't matter, you don't need to have an opinion. But I still think that's a lot of that's just publicly guarded. But I need to go draw it back for a second. How is this related to your question about Parmenides? You're asking, how is this?
Well, well, just in terms of asking questions of being and non-being versus just being stuck in seeming.
Yeah. I mean, I think from Parmenides' point of view, most scientists would be in the realm of seeming, and not all, but most, and also most modern philosophers would be, right. He would think of a Hegel as being a characteristic example of the Heraclitean dialectical thinker that thinks that being and not being is the same and not the same. And when he's trying to describe the various things which the way of mortals, teach, he'll tell you all the truths of astronomy that he knows, right? And that sort of thing. So that sort of empirical science of the cosmic world, as it was in his day, he will teach those things as things which are discovered on the way of mortals, right? He's not going to teach the fact that the moon shines with borrowed light as being as being part of the divine way, but he is going to treat it as a truth found on the way of mortals, something like that. Those are examples from what we actually have in his fragments, where Parmenides is actually talking about these things when he wants to explain what he thinks of as a truth of this status or a truth of that status. Does that help?
Yeah, so when let's say the truth, the moon is reflected light.
Yes.
Would that be a truth of being, or just
he thinks of that as the truth of opinion? It's a truth in the realm
opinion.
It's a truth in the realm of appearance and opinion. He does call it a truth, but he thinks it's the kind of thing that people concern themselves with on the way of mortals. They're concerned with understanding appearance and change, and they're doing so with categories of day and night and categories of opposites and contingent being and all that kind of thing. And that's the way that they reason in that area. And he thinks that there are things you can discover there, but are they reliable truths known apodictically? No.
Yeah, and so now one thing that Heidegger is coming along and doing is saying, yeah, humans are in this world of seeming, but Heidegger is actually going to say something that's universal to all those worlds of seeming.
Absolutely, and everyone after Parmenides is doing this. Even Plato is doing this. Plato is trying to. If Plato's self-understanding of his project is he wants to take that way of mortals, he wants to deal with the realm of opinion, he wants to do it by ascending from opinions, but he wants to find things in it that are as trustworthy in their own way, at least as much as they can be in that area, as these apodictic reasoning truths. And he thinks that the ideas, conceptual thinking in the realm of opinion can help him do that. And someone like an Aristotle will say, well, only if you get the logic right, and only if you have the first principles laid down in ways which are certain and grounded in experience, and whatever. The posture analytics will build up from this. But the point is, philosophers after Parmenides do want to invade the realm of seeming and the realm of opinion, but they want to bring some of the standards of truth from Parmenides into it and not relax them quite so much. And what they are worried about, people in that set, I mean, is the Protagorases of the world who say man is the measure of all things and being is perception, who are just going to relativize everything and pretend that anyone thinks is an opinion is a truth for them, right? And that's what we saw in the Theaetetus when Socrates has a dim view of Protagoras. It's because he sees something admirable in Parmenides' concern for certainty that he doesn't see the Protagorases of the world caring about, and he thinks that the Protagorases of the world are missing something that way. So in that sort of debate, I think Heidegger is more on the Protagoras or Heraclitus side of things, while also being informed about all these issues going on in the history of philosophy. Are there things which he does himself which are more like the Platonic reasoning? I think so. I think that a lot of his stuff is up to those Platonic standards. A lot of the historical structures he finds in the history of philosophy, for example, are things that any Platonist would recognize as Platonic reasoning about essences. It's just they happen to be about historical things, right? But the characteristic differences that he'll have from the Platonist is, his focus on the category of time and his focus on the category of experience and all those sorts of things that we've talked about.
Right. So in a sense, Western philosophy since Parmenides has been different philosophers trying to find the real truth or being in the world of appearances.
I would say since Plato rather than since Parmenides. I mean, I mean, Plato's allegory of the cave is all about, trying to bring that attempt to understand true being, to the realm of, mortal life, right? So that still means that it has this contrast between, a real world behind the apparent world that bothers people like Nietzsche, right? Someone's got some background noise.
I'll just go on mute in case.
I think it was probably Craig, but whatever. The point is that has all of Western philosophy, gone that way? Most of it has. Is there anyone? Are there some later people who are still stumping for the metaphysical standard of truth of what you can spin out from first principles in specific areas? Yes. You get some of that in some of the later Neoplatonists who think that they're able to spin out towers of abstraction about being in the one all the way up to whole ontologies. I'm thinking of people like Dionysius the Areopagite and so forth. And then in the modern times, the modern version of that kind of thing is what you get in like Hegel's Science of Logic, where he thinks that by reasoning from these first principles, he can spin out all the possible categories of human thought and trace them through history. As you got this far, but you didn't see this succeeding distinction.
And so in let's say Leibniz and his monads would be an example.
Leibniz and his monads is more constructivist than the things I'm talking about. It's trying to take more from experience, even for particular things he can't explain in experience, but that's a particular criticism of Leibniz. But certainly, when I think of people who are trying to be consistent first principles rationalists who are going to spin out the history of thought in from metaphysical principles, I think of Hegel and Fichte and Dionysius the Areopagite and Socrates Regina and people like that. I mean, there are other people in that tradition along the way, but there's definitely a philosophical tradition that comes out of the Platonists, goes to the Neoplatonists, goes off into religion and theology to some degree, and then comes back in German idealism. That's all about this. I build the tower of rational abstractions that explains the universe.
Right, and Heidegger would say, no, that's all still seeming. You're still in what Parmenides would have called.
Parmenides would call all of that seeming, absolutely.
Yeah.
But what Heidegger actually says in this particular essay is the second half of that, the German idealist version of that, is also all starting from the idea that the being that they're trying to explain is just a mental affirmation in consciousness, right? So it's all happening inside we've already made the move to the subject. So would he say the same thing about the Neoplatonists? I don't think so, but he doesn't really talk about them that much. If he does, he talks about them as having, fallen away from being able to directly experience the phenomena. He thinks they're abstractors. In our own reading, his dismissal of Plotinus is very, very rapid. He doesn't really take him seriously, although Plotinus might be closer to Parmenides in a lot of ways than he is himself. But he says, Plotinus is bringing in this distinction between noesis and aesthesis, and there's no such distinction there in the original. So he's bringing in this foreign distinction. So we can dismiss it as an unimportant way of trying to understand Parmenides. Well, I think that the ontological distinction read into Iantis is definitely at least as much that as anything that Plotinus was doing. Plotinus at least can point to the Noan aesthesis distinction in Plato as having been drawn from Parmenides. So there's more of a tradition connecting Plotinus's reading to Parmenides than there is, finding the twofold in Ianta, as something that's supposedly a thought there in Parmenides. If you just want to say that the twofold as a problem is there in pre-Socratic philosophy generally, fine, but it's something you're finding afterwards. That's as much a back reading by Heidegger as anything Plotinus is doing, is what I'm saying. So it's notable to me that Heidegger doesn't take people like Plotinus seriously. I mean, he shows that in Basic Problems of Phenomenology 2, where he takes the Plotinian view and dismisses it in 3 paragraphs or something. His tendency is to downplay anyone in that later Platonic tradition. The only people in the Platonic tradition he takes seriously are the people at the start of it, Plato and Aristotle. But I mean, to me, that's a bit of blind spot. I think that yes, Plato is weightier than those people. That's fair, but it's still a bit of a blind spot. And I think it's just because they're very different from him. They disagree with him on all these critical things. So.
Right, and Heidegger has a finite life. He can't, do all the philosophy
There's
without
very little evidence of that.
And
he keeps insisting that at the end of every essay, but then he has a book on absolutely everyone. So it's like,
but not enough Plotinus. But so in the modern period, Fichte, Hegel, they're all post-Cartesians.
Yes, and post-Kantians. Yeah,
have broad categories, but to all of them, since Parmenides, who think that they're really finding the solid abstractions that will lead them to being instead of doxa.
Yes.
Heidegger's saying, no, they're all still in the world of seeming, of doxa, not in the world.
Well, from Heidegger's point of view, the world of doxa is a necessary path that we all must take, right? I mean, he says all 3 of the paths must be taken, which is not what Parmenides says, but it is what Heidegger says. Of the people we're reading here, the one that is Heidegger's hero and is in the place he's recommending, it's Heraclitus. Heraclitus is the guy who's closest to him in both content of thought and in character and recommendations for how to learn and so forth. But when it comes to the Parmenidean paths, he says take them all, and you have to know that they're there. But he calls it a standing decision, but it's a standing decision. Which of these 3 paths you're dedicated to? Be dedicated to all of them. I'm sorry, to me that's not a decision, but
yeah, and arguably from Heidegger's point of view, Heraclitus was the one who got there, and then it got lost because Heraclitus said, "Being loves to hide," and
yes.
That's what Heidegger.
Then it proceeded to hide. Yes. Well, we will. That's a very good segue to our next time, because our next time we will be reading that fragment, the Aletheia fragment. So yes, and I think that, to me, part of the point of ending the book on that is that he is the one that Heidegger is closest to. I think he's also the one that shows that the pre-Socratics got closest to some of his own insights. I think that Heraclitus in particular disproves the idea that any of these things were not accessible to the Greeks. They were accessible to the Greeks of the pre-Socratic period. There's things that Heidegger could learn from Heraclitus on the point, as well as things that he will agree with him on. Is Heraclitus, Heraclitus is in some ways a much more conventional thinker than Parmenides. Parmenides is a paradoxical thinker. He's a thinker who's trying to shock. And Heraclitus is famously a bit of a misanthrope, but he's not paradoxical in that way. The things he's saying are true are things you can plausibly believe are true, so to speak. The things Parmenides are saying are true are meant to be somewhat outlandish. But what am I getting at?
Next time.
We'll definitely get to all that next time. But the point that I'm getting at is that I don't think Heidegger has proven that any of these things were fundamentally hidden already in the Greeks. I think if he wanted to make the claim that the distinction of the twofold was something that Parmenides was not really conscious of, I think that's fair. I think it's also fair to say that Parmenides disagreed with him on the importance of that twofold. He disagreed with him in particular on the importance of the time experience
Jason freeze or did my
perceptible.
computer freeze?
Sorry, Joe. It was you. we're going. I was going to say what's the point? The point is some of his criticisms of Parmenides are valid criticisms of Parmenides, and some of them are just ways that Parmenides disagrees with him. Put it that way. But Heraclitus comes off in these essays as thoughtful on these questions as Heidegger himself. Maybe not all the way down, but enough down the line that none of the previous claims about how philosophy, even in the Greeks, was closed off of these things will hold up. You can still try to make the argument that it closed down later, certainly, separate discussion. But the Greeks, certainly Heraclitus, had access to these understandings of the nature of not just being as emerging presence and these multiple senses of being, but also the notion of truth as aletheia, and of aletheia as necessarily involving lethe, all of those things which Heidegger sees as being critical to the history of truth that we got when he was talking about Plato. They're all there. So we'll go through a lot of that next time, and that's one of the reasons I'm just phrasing this now, because I want to go through next time, is it true or is it false that the Greeks could not see these things? I think it's clear that they could see them, and some of them did. And I think Heidegger even agrees with that by the end of this book. When he's face to face with what Heraclitus actually says on the topics he cares about, he's going to be fair and agree with him. And none of this more sweeping claims about no one before us could have seen these things are going to hold up, right? That's just rhetoric at this point. Dan?
Yeah, along the line of what you said, I think Heidegger is attacking once the German idealist and their systems. They construct all these systems, and that goes back to Aristotle and categories and stuff like that. And then he also attacks like the axiomatic programs that goes back to Euclid and so on. And also like he, in a more weaker form, he attacks the modern like theory. He goes after that, and he like whatever like. Anyway, but
I agree with all that. I mean, I think his primary targets in those sweeping declarations are not the ancient Greeks. There are various modern things he doesn't like. There are various things he doesn't like about modern philosophy, whether it's axiomatic programs or systematizing philosophy or too rigid a positivism or whatever. There's lots of things he doesn't like about characteristic things about modern philosophy. Nietzschean nihilism, right? Which is how we got into this one, right? All of which to me are criticisms of modern philosophy that have clearly more soundness to them than the generalization of them to metaphysics has been off the rails since the beginning, right? To me, most of the evidence is piling up that, yes, Heidegger's diagnosis of many of the problems of modern philosophy is just, but most of those problems arise later in the history than he's always letting on. And that matters because if one is considering where there are perspectives that could be corrective or second beginnings or any other way you want to put it for overcoming any of those issues, the incision doesn't have to go as deep, if you understand me, right? There's plenty of valuable things in ancient philosophy that are very much a part of the tradition and that don't deserve any of the brickbats that the Nietzsches of the world threw at them, and that Heidegger too flippantly parroted before he examined the evidence, in my opinion. And after he examined the evidence, they come off better. Anyway, that's my own umpire's ball and strike caller, watching them fight each other, because I'm not in this fight. I'm just watching how well they do. I'm slightly lying. I'm partly in this fight. I'm on the side of Plato. You know that. All right. But this is great. So I want to get one other thing, and it doesn't have to be input now, but if you already have thoughts, they can mention them. It can also just be input by email. What do you want to do next? Because our next time we're going to be finishing this for sure. And I want to say that that's going to be in 4 weeks time. So that would be April the 9th, if people can do the April the 9th. Anyone have an issue with April the 9th?
It's Easter.
Oh,
Um,
does that mean we should do the 16th instead?
No, I don't give a rat's. I don't do Easter, but somebody out there might not have realized it. You know?
All right, I will preliminarily set it for the 9th, and if 3 people object, I will move to the 16th, but otherwise we're doing it on the 9th.
April 1 would work. And what's the
Sorry?
April 1st might work.
April 1st, I have another event.
Excuse me, I mean 7 days minus 9. April 2nd.
Yes. I think not, because April 1st is my birthday and I'm planning to be up very late. So
Okay, 16.
Well,
no.
No, I don't do Easter either. So you know,
well, let's aim for 9th unless someone tells me 16th. And then I want to, throw out as possible next things. There's a whole bunch of Heidegger we could do. In this one, I could imagine doing the question concerning technology itself. That is the title essay. This is if we sort of wanted to circle back to some of the Nietzsche and modern nihilism things. I can imagine wanting to do this one because Dan brought it up. This is the basic questions of philosophy. This is the issue of philosophy and wonder, which is a great one to do if you want to understand sort of the, psychological and phenomenological origins of philosophy and all of that. And it's also a relatively easy book, in my opinion. There is this, which, somewhat hard book. I got to say, it was a little bit disappointing to me. There's some wonderful things in there about the meaning of aletheia and so on, and some big things at the beginning of the essay. It doesn't get as deep into the actual Parmenides philosophy as I wanted him to. There's this, which is much more challenging. There's lots of Greek in it. Will drive Joe insane, but it's also wrestles with the gigantomachia and all the biggest questions we've been talking about. You get to have the actual Parmenidean stranger, and Plato and all the big people talking about the war of the giants over being between the army of Homer and the army of Parmenides. But it may be a little bit much as an immediate next. And then this, since we had some little readings from it, it's a more intro book. I think we probably want to go more advanced than that. So anyway, my vote would probably be this one immediately, or the question, because we already had the book, and it would get us back to some of the stuff we were on with the Nietzsche before we got off on the pre-Socratics. But open to anyone's opinions on it, and if anyone has things outside of Heidegger they're interested in doing, I'm open to that too. But right now we seem to be on a Heidegger groove, and there seem to be a lot of people here for that. So I don't want to change that up and drive half people away. I will mention one other thing that I would be interested in doing sometime if people are open for it, but only when there's enough prep time that people tell me they want to do it. I wouldn't mind doing Plato's Republic with the group over multiple sessions, if people are interested. All right, anyway, so just some of your thoughts on any of those things in email, and for the rest, we'll plan on the 9th for next time.
All right, well, quicker than emails. So they all sound good to me except Plato's Sophist.
Okay.
Maybe the first third would be good, but it's like 600 pages or something.
It is huge, yes.
And in the first third, I think it's quite important in the Heidegger sort of finds phenomenology in the Nicomachean Ethics. And I think that's pretty interesting move. Even though he's not at his best, I think Introduction to Metaphysics, you say we might be too advanced for it. I kind of think that's a good, it's easier to get into than the other books.
I agree with you. I was just thinking
deep stuff in there too.
I was just thinking if part of the reason to do the depth of stuff we've been doing is because we want to steer our way towards eventually being able to do all of the, last stuff, the latest stuff. And if we want to do that, I just don't know this is a signpost on the way. This is more like a, going back to intro stuff.
And So I just wanted to mention one that I haven't read in years and years that came up is What is Called Thinking.
That's also a good idea. That's also on Nietzsche as well. So what is called thinking is another.
And I'm good with Plato's Republic if we ever want to do that.
Okay, yeah. So both of those are fine ideas. I'll add what is called thinking as a possible list. For those who don't know, what is called thinking is the subject matter. The main text is a single line of Nietzsche: "The wasteland grows, woe to him who hides wastelands within." But anyway, so some shades of T.S. Eliot. All right, so send me your thoughts by email, and I'll put this up later tonight. And thanks everyone for coming. It was great. See you next time. Bye.